You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 370, Revelation 6. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Pretty good. I had my first fantasy baseball draft last week, Trey, and I'm relatively happy. Looks good.
So this is something I can get behind our audience, being
there you go.
Annoyed at us.
I'm not going to belabor it. I'm just
teasing.
That's what's new.
Teasing. I'm teasing. How'd you do in the draft?
I think I did pretty well. It's a roto league, so we'll see. Now I get to just see and watch which guys get injured.
Yeah.
That's my fantasy experience right there.
Well, the time of this recording, it's actually March Madness weekend, the time of this recording. So I'm excited because my Texas Tech made it and Abilene Christian University made it. ACU made it. So ACU is going to play Texas tomorrow as the time of this recording. So by the time this is out, we're already going to know the end of all of this. But
I forgot all about that because I don't watch basketball. But
I'm excited for Abilene.
I don't even
Christian.
know who's supposed to win.
Gonzaga is number one overall.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I've been on their campus once, so I guess I have a connection since they're in the Northwest.
What were you doing on their campus?
There was a regional SBL meeting on their campus one year, I went out and gave a paper and did what you do at regional meetings. Walk around and listen to stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So it's my experience.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
At least I was there.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And we were talking about sports memorabilia before, and my son on his, he just turned 12 a few weeks ago, and my parents gave him an autographed Emmitt Smith jersey. So I asked him, I was like, hey, you want to keep that in my office? And of course, that didn't go down well. So I didn't get anything
Right.
like that. We were talking, I didn't get anything like that for my birthday.
Yeah. Hey, mom and dad, why did you waste your retirement?
Exactly.
on your grandson. You could have done that on me.
Exactly. I'm your son. I don't get anything. So I'm looking at an autographed Emmitt Smith. We haven't hung it up yet. So I'm looking at it, and it's giving me good vibes here. Especially since we're about to, go down to talk about the Four Horsemen here coming up.
Yeah, there you go. We'll accept that as a segue. How's that?
Okay.
That's acceptable.
Okay.
That's a football reference and a Revelation reference. So
you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the good news we should add is that we're actually going to get through Revelation 6 in one episode. So there's no, 2, 3, 4, ad infinitum parts to this. And I judge these things by, since the series is about the, John's use of the Old Testament and Revelation, how much Old Testament stuff's going on in the passage? Can I get through that in one pass or not? So that's how we judge these things. And in this case, we can. Some of these things are going to be, familiar from chapter 5, but the new stuff, put in here, we're going to be able to do it. So I'm going to read to start off here the first, Revelation 6, 1 through 8, and that'll, get us into what we need to do, at least as far as, our beginning point, just to refresh everybody's memory. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. So that's the first 8 verses. Obviously, there's some familiar things here. We've got the Lamb. We've got the living creatures. Again, these cherubim sort of figures, from earlier Revelation 4 and 5. We've got the reference to death and Hades. Again, that's back in Revelation 1 and Revelation 3. So there are a few familiar things here, but there's going to be, at least one case we're going to note kind of a bit of a twist in what John is getting us to think about. But let's just start again with the obvious. The Lamb opened one of the seals in the first verse. Now, Owen in his commentary observes something kind of obvious at the beginning here. He says, since it's obviously very difficult to imagine a lamb opening a sealed scroll, like how would he do that without fingers and thumbs? It is possible, Owen says, that the figure of the lamb has subsequently been superimposed on an originally anthropomorphic figure. The group of 4 visions in 6:1-8 is structured by using the 4 cherubim, each of whom summons one of the 4 horsemen, which afflict the world with a variety of plagues, unquote. Now, this raises an interesting, but, to be honest with you, it's not terribly important point about when John describes the lamb, is he actually looking at a lamb, or is he using the word lamb to describe Jesus? Okay, like I looked in the lamb that was slain, and he's standing before God. Okay, this Revelation 5 language. I mean, it is possible. I would agree with On. It is possible that what John's actually looking at is Jesus, but he uses the language of the Lamb because John does that elsewhere. Again, if we have the same author here as in the Gospel, and we've sort of presumed that, we have references to Jesus as the Lamb of God, okay, that takes away the sin of the world. When John says that in John chapter 1, at the Jordan there while he's baptizing, behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. Okay, obviously he's referring to Jesus, and it's equally as obvious it's not a vision. I mean, that's a real-time boots on the ground event. But it does create this question, especially when the lamb is doing things that in this case require fingers and thumbs. At least you would think that that's what's going on here. How else do you open a sealed scroll? Maybe the lamb just looked at it. Who knows? I mean, we're not told. But it at least opens the door, and commentators have gone back and forth like, okay, what's John actually looking at? And as I just read in the On quote, maybe the figure of the lamb has been subsequently superimposed on an originally anthropomorphic figure. The ultimate answer is who knows, okay? Because all we do have is the verbiage, the vocabulary. We have things that seem incongruent with the vocabulary, but hey, it's an apocalyptic vision. Kind of like dreams, don't need to really conform to reality as we experience it. All right, so, an apocalyptic vision may not need, these sort of niceties either, but I thought I'd mention it because it is part of the discussion. Again, I don't think it's terribly important either way, but just, we run into it right away. Now, Beale, when he opens his discussion of the chapter, he writes this. It's similar, but a few differences here. Revelation 6:1-8 is intended to show that Christ rules over such an apparently chaotic world and that suffering does not occur indiscriminately or by chance. That's actually going to be a fairly important thought. Because who holds the keys to death and Hades? That would be Jesus. That would be the risen Christ. We've had that in a previous episode. So keep that in the back of your mind. We'll get back to it. Beale writes, this section reveals, in fact, that destructive events are brought about by Christ for both redemptive and judicial purposes. The command for each of the 4 destructive horses and riders originates from the throne room where Christ, i.e. the Lamb, opens each seal. The cherubim around the throne issue commands to the horsemen in response to the opening of each seal. Only then do the horsemen wreak their havoc. So what Beale is doing here is he's linking the release of the apocalypse to the command by virtue of the opening of the seals of the Lamb. Jesus is the one that launches the war here. That's the bottom line. Okay, and we often, we don't think of Jesus like this. We don't think of the Lamb like this, frankly. And if you remember back in chapter 5 when we talked about the Lamb, the imagery works 2 ways. We think of a lamb as, cute and harmless and skipping around the field and we think of the ewe lamb, from the parable with Nathan and David and how pathetic that is and so on and so forth. And the lamb was a sacrificial victim, in Old Testament culture, Jewish culture. But lamb imagery was also used of the gods and of rule and of power and of might. So the metaphor, there's two sides to it. And here, very obviously, we're not seeing the passive victim side. We're seeing the other side. Now, other scholars, again, have noted as they proceed through this that the most obvious Old Testament source for these first 8 verses is Zechariah 6:1 through 8. So I'm going to read that because, again, once I read through it, you'll see again that this is where the obvious points of connection are. Not the only ones, but this is the most obvious. So Zechariah 6 begins this way. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots. It's not 4 horsemen, it's 4 chariots. Come out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, What are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, These are going out to the 4 winds of heaven, after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes toward the north country, the white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. And the strong horses came out, and they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, Go, patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried to me, Behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country. It's the end of verses 1 through 8, Zechariah 6. So this is a bit more obscure, if I can use that word. I mean, how can anything be more obscure than the book of Revelation? Well, okay, let's try Zechariah on for size. And we've seen, John repurpose passages in Zechariah already. And here he is again. And virtually all Old Testament scholars acknowledge some relationship between the 4 horses of Zechariah 6, or the 4 chariots, teams of horses. So they're going to look at those 4 chariot teams, and they're going to link them back to the teams of horses in Zechariah 1. So the steps go this way. I'm reading Revelation 6. That takes my mind back to Zechariah 6. And Zechariah 6, the precedent for that was Zechariah 1, because there's also chariot teams of horses there. The problem is, all Old Testament scholars are going to notice these things. And again, New Testament scholars are going to notice these things too, because the references are, at least on the surface, are pretty obvious. The question is, what's the nature of the relationship between Revelation 6, Zechariah 6, and of course, looping in Zechariah 1? And that is, hotly debated. Ultimately, sort of aligning all 3 of these passages, Revelation 6, Zechariah 1, is peripheral to what we're doing here in the podcast. You can read long sections, pages and pages and pages of how do we reconcile the colors precisely in Revelation 6 with the ones in Zechariah 6? Does dappled mean gray? All this sort of stuff. How do we go from 3 chariot teams to 4, and then to the 4 individual Look, for our purposes, we don't really need to care about this. There are ways that commentators fix or resolve these issues. They fix these problems. If you want the mathematical resolution to these things and the color palette resolution to these things, again, you can go consult a good exegetical commentary. I would think, though, for our purposes, some general conclusions are more relevant, more germane. So I'm just going to give you 4 of them here. The scenes in Zechariah 1 and 6 include an angel figure that may be the angel of Yahweh. Now, we ran into this when we discussed Revelation 1:4. So we might have the angel of the Lord in Zechariah 1 and 6. Can't be completely certain that that's the case, but you can make a case for it. And that's going to matter, when we're looking at Revelation here. In Revelation 6, the 4 horsemen are unleashed from God's throne, which is an integral element of the divine council scene in Revelation 4 and 5. So let's not lose sight of that. Third, the 4 horses correspond to the 4 corners of the earth. In other words, all the earth is under patrol or is going to be affected, in the case of Revelation, negatively. All 4 corners of the earth, the whole earth there's going to be an impact here. And that, again, back to the language of Zechariah 6, they're patrolling. Again, And there are commentators that some of them would see that as a neutral term. Others would see, well, they're going out with more of a purpose than that. And what John says about the purpose, these plagues and whatnot, and warfare and death, and all, is not inconsistent with Zechariah 6. Okay, wonderful. All right. We're not going to drill down, or we'd have 3 or 4 parts, just looking at each horse individually. I don't want to spend an episode on a horse, 4 times. There are ways to reconcile these things. But again, we've got possibly the angel of the Lord. We've got the divine council element with God's throne. We've got the whole earth, the 4 corners of the earth affected by this. And fourthly, the horses in Zechariah are actually chariot teams. And the chariots, in the Old Testament context, were instruments of war. So I think it is arguable that the judgment idea is not absent in Zechariah. We'll say that much. The chariot teams are sent out to punish the nations that are oppressing God's people. So if you read Zechariah in context, patrol, what I'm suggesting is, because it's a chariot team, I'm going to be on the side of the commentators that say, if he was just going out for a look, you'd go a single rider on a horse. If you send a chariot, okay, that implies something, violent, or it implies judgment, because this is an instrument of war. And in the context of Zechariah, that passage is about God avenging his people, God punishing the nations that are oppressing God's people. And that is very much in concert with the flavor of Revelation, even at this point. Because haven't we just read through the letters where God is basically saying, Christ, Jesus is saying, hey, endure to the end, and the Lord knows your suffering. The Lord knows, those who are persecuting and oppressing you, and he will not forget that. And he, they will have their day. Okay, the Lord is not going to let this, pass without, a judgment here. And so this is unleashed in chapter 6. So the contexts are actually, more similar than you'd think. Now, by analogy, again, just to summarize all that, in Revelation 6, we have the Lamb unleashing judgment on the world, 4 corners, the whole world, by means of the 4 horsemen. And they are going to punish the world, i.e., those who are oppressing, persecuting the ones who follow the Lamb. Okay, remember Revelation 5, the martyrs, that get the white robes. And this is the context for this. It's very much a day of the Lord kind of feel to it. The Lord is going to avenge his own. Now, if the figure in Zechariah, among the myrtles, okay, back to Zechariah here, with these chariot teams, is in fact the angel of Yahweh, if that's the case, and again, just go back to where we talked about Revelation 1:4 and 1:5, then by analogy, that would align the angel to Jesus, which of course, this is part of the 2 powers thinking, 2 powers motif. But it's not, I'm bringing it up not to make an ontological point. Okay, angel of Yahweh, who is Yahweh, that's Jesus. So we've got Godhead language here. Okay, this is well-traversed territory. For this podcast, and of course, I spent a lot of time on that Old Testament God as man, the Old Testament theme in Unseen Realm. But I want to make a different point, not an ontological one. The angel of Yahweh did indeed wreak destruction on God's enemies in the Old Testament. Okay, let's think about what the angel does on occasion. For example, the angel with the drawn sword in his hand at Joshua 5, to precipitate the conquest. Another example is the angel of 1 Chronicles 21 that assaults Jerusalem. Okay, those 2 scenes, Joshua 5, 1 Chronicles 21, the figure there, the angel of the Lord and the commander, the captain of the Lord's host, they're the same entity. They're the same figure. Again, I've spent a lot of time in Unseen Realm and in other books establishing why this is the case. And the key phrase is the drawn sword in the hand. That phrase is only used 3 times in Hebrew as it's written in the Hebrew Bible. And the other 2, besides Joshua 5, are absolutely clear angel of the Lord passages. So, we have a correlation here, and you have a warrior figure here. Now, I'm going to quote a little bit that I wrote in the Angels book, just about this, because this gets looped into other passages, including the destroyer at Passover. So, just bear with me here as I summarize some of this material. I wrote in the Angels book, it is clear from both passages, Joshua 5, 1 Chronicles 21, that the angel of Yahweh is in view and that he brings destruction. Mashkit is a term used in 1 Chronicles 21. Interestingly, this is the identical term used to describe the angel of death in the account of the death of the firstborn on the eve of the first Passover, which reads this. I'm going to read Exodus 12, 13, 21, and 23. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy, mashkit, to destroy you, when I strike the land of Egypt. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not allow the destroyer, mashkit, to enter your houses to strike you. The mashkit, continuing on with what I wrote, who was the angel of Yahweh in 1 Chronicles 21, and the parallel is 2 Samuel 24, is here distinguished by the line, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer, the mashkit, to enter your houses to strike you. Yet we read elsewhere in other passages that it was Yahweh himself who destroyed the firstborn. So let me just stop there. If you look at this again, drawn sword, the mashkit language, go back to Passover, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to enter your houses, the mashkit. So those are clearly two figures. But yet in other passages, Yahweh is the destroyer. So you have this, again, blending, where the destroyer is but isn't Yahweh, this whole two powers thing going on. Here are some of the passages that loop Yahweh into this. He sent Moses his servant and Aaron whom he had chosen. He struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of all their strength. For I know that the Lord is great, and that the Lord is above all gods. He it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both man and a beast. So the first passage there was Psalm 105, 26 and 36. Okay, he struck down all the firstborn. He, God, okay. And the second one was, again, he it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt. Again, the divine name Yahweh is in that passage. That's Psalm 135, 5 and 8. There's another one, Psalm 136, 3 and 10. Give thanks to the Lord of Lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever. So it sure looks like, Yahweh and the destroyer are one and the same, but yet they're different. Again, this two powers thing. Some people have argued, though, that Psalm 78, 48, and 51 complicate this, that it gets in the way. And I'm going to suggest that it really doesn't, but I'm going to read the passage. He, that is Yahweh in context, gave over their cattle to the hail and their flocks to the thunderbolts. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress. A company of destroying angels. The Hebrew is malakei ra'im. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the first fruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. So some would say that, God didn't do this destroying. It was this mashkit who isn't Yahweh, and people will deny the correlations and then assign the destruction to the, quote, a company of destroying angels, like to get God off the hook here. The complication is only surface level. Again, in Angels, I wrote, the ESV's translation, destroying angels, is somewhat misleading with respect to the terminology we are attempting to trace. The Hebrew term translated destroying is not the word mashkit, associated with the destroyer in the passages we looked at earlier. We should also observe that Psalm 78:49 does not say the destroying angels killed the firstborn. It never actually says that. The act is once again attributed to Yahweh in verse 51, of Psalm 78. Yahweh may have sent angels to enact the other plagues, but the death of the firstborn is attributed to him, and of course to the mashkit, who is the angel of the Lord. These angels, the group of angels, do not act in the role of the destroyer. That is this single figure who is also Yahweh. Now, the point to be taken here, why am I bringing all this up? Again, it's Old Testament context for what we read in Revelation 6. Because here it is not Yahweh or the angel, is it or isn't, the angel of the Lord. I mean, it's the risen Christ. But if you're going back to Zechariah for the parallel, if indeed that is the angel of the Lord, i.e. the destroyer, that would make a lot of sense, because look what the Lamb does in Revelation 6. He unleashes death and plagues and all this sort of stuff. It's kind of interesting, if you start, and we'll do this in a subsequent episode, start to think about the use of the plague imagery for what happens on earth in Revelation, because there, at one point, you have the Passover lamb slain, and the angel of the Lord is the one destroying, the firstborn. And now, as Revelation progresses, as the salvation plan of God progresses, you have the Lamb now who is Christ, again, who is also the destroyer. I mean, it's a reversal. It's a folding back of the elements. And now, instead of the people of God, sort of having to kind of duck the plagues here, it's still, God, but now it's, again, the risen Christ unleashing all this on the enemies of the people of God, and so on and so forth. So there's a parallel, but yet there's also this sort of reversal unfolding of certain of the elements. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, the point for today to be taken here is that in Revelation 6, the slot that would be reserved for either Yahweh or the destroyer, the destroying angel, who is the angel of the Lord, is Jesus. The language here is day of the Lord judgment, and Jesus is not the gentle Savior. He is the destroying judge. And this isn't commonly the way we think about Jesus. I mean, let's just be honest. We often do not, sort of put this, when we think Christology, we don't think of this. But this is part of Christology. I'm not going to rabbit trail too much, but if you're interested, I have put an article in the protected folder. Tremper Longman, who was an Old Testament prof for many years at Westminster Seminary, now he's at, I think it's Westmont in California. Tremper Longman's article, here's the title, The Divine Warrior, the New Testament Use of an Old Testament Motif. It's Westminster Theological Journal back in 1982. It's a really good article because it shows how the New Testament portrayal of Jesus is not just a passive suffering servant, the lamb, the sacrificial victim. There are a lot of passages, and it's not just Revelation 6, that use divine warrior imagery of the risen Christ. And some of it's even like before, you get to Acts and beyond. I mean, there are hints of it. So it's just very interesting. But this is part of Christology. Here in Revelation 6, we don't have the gentle Savior, we have the destroying judge. It's the same person. Now, another question or issue that arises from the opening of the scroll by the Lamb is whether the plagues represented by the four horsemen are sequential or simultaneous. And this is, again, for me anyway, this was interesting enough to park on a little bit because we assume that, and again, in popular prophecy talk, okay, so let's drift over into that a little bit. We assume a sequence of plagues, this one followed by this one, followed by this one, followed by this one. But there's actually an issue with that. So Beale summarizes the issue of the problem. He writes, the visionary sequence of the four seals being opened could represent sequential occurrences of each disaster, one after another. But more probably, the disasters are simultaneous. This is suggested in that, number one, the fourth seal summarizes the prior three. Number two, the models of Ezekiel 14, 12, and 13, and of course Zechariah 6, 5, and 8, and the synoptic gospel eschatological discourse, on which Revelation 6, 1 through 8 is also based, portray events of the tribulation occurring simultaneously. Indeed, the synoptic parallels, though fairly uniform, even have different sequences of the trials from Revelation 6, 1 through 11. Number three, the glorified saints in Revelation 6, 9 through 11, we haven't gotten there yet, but we'll just loop this in. They appear to have suffered under all four trials portrayed in the seals. Nevertheless, a logical pattern repeatable throughout the age is discernible. Conquest, first rider, together with civil unrest, especially for persecuted Christians, that's the second rider, leads to famine, the third rider, and death, the fourth rider. Ezekiel 14, 12 through 23 is also formative for this section. We'll get to that momentarily. Ezekiel 14:21 is explicitly quoted in Revelation 6:8b, where it functions as a general summary of the preceding trials of conquest, sword, and famine, the first two of which include death. This quotation of Ezekiel also adds one more trial, affliction by beasts. The quoted words have the same function in Ezekiel 14:21, where they clearly sum up the four preceding statements about trials as, quote, four evil judgments. These punishments come on nations in general when they are unfaithful to God. The trials there are listed respectively as lack of bread and famine, Ezekiel 14:13, wild beasts 14:15, sword 14:17, and death 14:19. The point of Ezekiel 14:21 is that all Israelites will suffer persecution because of rampant idolatry. And the purpose of the trials is to punish the majority of the nation because of its sin, and simultaneously to purify the righteous remnant by the testing of their faith. Now, the point here is that, I mean, let's think about this. When we talked about the scroll itself, we actually did get into this a little bit, and that is, okay, the scroll has 7 seals. Just think of a scroll sealed 7 times. If you open the first 4, you still can't read the scroll. So this notion of, you open one seal and now you can read it, what happens, or now something. In other words, it mars the linear succession idea. And so what Beale is arguing, I mean, we talked about that last time, but he's also bringing it up here. The linear idea of the judgments isn't really a good one. Again, because you have the 4th summarizing the previous 3. You've got the synoptic gospels. Some they don't always have the same order. Sometimes they're these summary statements that occur simultaneously. In other words, you may have to wait till all the seals are open for all of this stuff to sort of explode. It's not typically the way we think. And certain eschatological systems, certain end time systems, actually sort of depend on sequencing. Okay, so that's all I'll say there. And it's not really a great argument. So let's go into Revelation 6:9 through 11. I'll read that. When he appeared, or when he opened the 5th seal, the Lamb, he opens the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God, and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe, and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. Bit ominous, but let's just pick our way through a few things. Under the altar, Revelation 6:9. What's the altar? What is the meaning of altar? Now, there's 2 possibilities here. On comments on this, but he doesn't really commit himself to either possibility, but I'll read what he says anyway. He says, since in Jewish thought the earthly temple was modeled after the heavenly temple, it is appropriate to ask to what the 8 occurrences of the term altar in the book of Revelation refer. The tabernacle and the Solomonic temple and the Herodian temple had 2 distinct altars. There was the outer altar, or the altar of burnt offering, located along with the bronze laver in the court before the entrance to the holy place, i.e., in the court of the priests. That's Josephus's language. And the inner altar, or the golden altar of incense, situated just in front of the paroquet or curtain, separating the holy place or nave from the devir, the most holy place, Leviticus 4:18. So you've actually got 2 altars here, but he doesn't really land anywhere. Now, Beale does a little bit more with this, so I'm going to share what he writes. He says, the mention of the altar here in association with those slain evokes the sacrificial nature of their suffering. This altar is not the brazen altar of sacrifice, although the sacrificial blood was poured out at the base of that altar. Leviticus 4:18, verse 30 and verse 34. And in Revelation 6:10, the sacrificed saints are under the altar. Also see Leviticus 17:11. The blood sprinkled on this altar is said to have the nephesh of the flesh, the life of the flesh in it. The better identification, Beale thinks, is with the golden altar of incense, which stood in the vicinity of the Holy of Holies. This is clearly referred to in Revelation 8:3 through 5, and Revelation 9:13, and in the developments of those references in Revelation 11:1, 14:18, and 16:7. The sacrificial blood of the Day of Atonement was poured on that altar, and incense was burned on it. Exodus 30:1 through 10, Leviticus 4:7, and Hebrews 9:4. The saints, Beale says, are strangely under the altar instead of on it. This may allude merely to blood running down to the base of the altar after having been poured on its top, but what is more probably in mind is the association or virtual equation in both Revelation and Jewish writings of this altar with the throne of God, whose sovereign purposes ultimately protect the saints. Therefore, placing the saints under the altar emphasizes the divine protection that has held sway over their souls, despite even their loss of physical life because of persecution. So let me just, that's the end of his quote, but he's angling for altar of incense because of its proximity to the throne, i.e. the Ark of the Covenant behind the veil in the Old Testament. And also because in other references to the altar in the book of Revelation, it's more clearly the altar of incense. And so Beale, again, he's landing there, and he's again doing some extrapolation here of what the imagery might convey. And in this case, it's the ultimate protection. You know, if the saints are under this particular altar, the altar of incense right outside the curtain, you know, where God's throne is, it seems to be the best match. Well, then what that would speak to is that even if you lose your physical life, you're still going to be with the Lord. Okay, that kind of thing. So this is where Beale angles toward and where he lands. And I'm persuaded by that only because of the subsequent references to the altar more clearly being the altar of incense. So that would make sense to me. And again, what John is doing here is he's assuming a certain amount of knowledge of the temple furnishings and where they're situated, and again, kind of ritual procedure in the Old Testament. He's repurposing that to equate it with the throne that he's described in Revelation 4 and 5, where the Lamb is. I mean, the Lamb's not enthroned yet, but the Lamb is in the presence of the Lord. And so judgment is going out from this location, and it's simultaneously the same location where the souls of the faithful are still there. They're there in the presence of God, and they're given white robes, and yes, you're going to be with the Lord forever. So it's this, he's using the imagery to create both a judgment context, that judgment is coming out from the one who has authority, ultimately the one who has the keys of death and Hades. You know, if Jesus is in control of death and Hades now, and he is, because John has just made that point a few chapters earlier, then he gets to decide the severity of the judgment and where the final destination of those judged is going to be. And if you're on his side, yes, even if you lose your physical life in the wake of all this upheaval, this chaos, this apocalyptic stuff, be assured that the Lord knows who you are and you will be with him. That's the messaging. And John is using Old Testament imagery to communicate those ideas. Now, for the white robe in Revelation 6:11, you could just see our discussion back in Revelation 3:4. We're not going to say any more about that with the white robe imagery and some of the other stuff that goes with it. Let's move to 6:12 through 17. I'll read the passage. John writes, "When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb." There you go again with the one on the throne and the Lamb distinguished. "For the great day of their wrath, there's two of them, has come, and who can stand?" Now this section amalgamates a number of Old Testament passages. This is where John has just thrown everything into the blender again. You know, Beale writes, "The judgment of the world is depicted with stock in trade Old Testament imagery for the dissolution of the cosmos. This portrayal is based on a mosaic of Old Testament passages that are brought together because of the cosmic metaphors of judgment that they have in common. The quarry of texts," it's a nice line, "from which the description has been drawn is composed primarily of," here's the grocery list, Isaiah 13:10 through 13, Isaiah 24:1 through 6, Isaiah 24:19 through 23, Isaiah 34:4, Ezekiel 32:6 and 8, Joel 2:10, Joel 2:30 and 31, Joel 3:15 and 16, and Habakkuk 3:6 to 11. And then Beale notes you might get some allusions to Amos 8:8 and 9, Jeremiah 4:23 through 28, and Psalm 68:7. I mean, like I said, John's throwing everything into the blender here. These same Old Testament texts, Beale writes, are also influential in Matthew 24:29, Mark 13:24 and 25, and Acts 2:19 and 20, which also quotes Joel 2:30 and 31. In other words, the same, to use Beale's phrase, the same quarry, okay, that John is mining all of these Old Testament passages from. Okay, they all have apocalyptic flavoring in the Old Testament. They're not only repurposed here in what John's doing in Revelation 6, but they get repurposed in synoptic gospel apocalyptic passages and the book of Acts, discussion. This is Acts 2, 19 through 20, about the inauguration, of the new covenant, the coming of the Holy Spirit, and so on and so forth. So all of these things are sort of just thrown into the blender. Beale later observes, quote, the most formative influences among these texts, and this is a point of interest for those of you who are, again, familiar with Unseen Realm context, is Isaiah 34:4, after which Revelation 6:13 and 14 has most closely been patterned, unquote. And you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, go back to Isaiah 34:4. Let's just read the whole thing. We'll read verses 1 through 4, because this is where you get both the judgment of the powers on the earth and also the powers in the heavens, okay, the spiritual world. Isaiah 34, starting in verse 1, draw near, O nations, to hear, and give attention, O peoples. Let the earth hear, and all that fills it, the world and all that comes from it. For the Lord is enraged against all the nations, and furious against all their host. That's a key phrase, their host. So God is angry at the nations, and he's angry at their host. He has devoted them to destruction, which is the Karem language of the conquest back in the days of Moses and Joshua. He has given them over for slaughter. Their slain shall be cast out. The stench of their corpses shall rise. The mountains shall flow with their blood. All the host of heaven shall rot away. All the skies roll up like a scroll. All, there it is again, their host shall fall. As leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. So that verse 4, all the host of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll. All their host shall fall, as leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from a fig tree. Now, if you're in my Unseen Realm class at the Awakening School, I know this is going to be familiar because we actually spent some time in a class period on it, but I'll give you the quick version here. And I mention it, I believe, I don't know if I mentioned this in Unseen Realm, it might be another book, but if you do a search for Tseva'am, their host, it's just the word Tsava, Lord of hosts is Tsevaot, Adonai Tsevaot, Lord of hosts. The singular is Tsava, refers to an army or a group or, the host of heaven, celestial objects. But Tseva'am is that word with, again, a plural suffix, their host, attached to it. If you do a search specifically on that word form with that suffix, every time it's used in the Hebrew Bible, it speaks of celestial objects, not earthly armies. Every time. So Isaiah 34, again, we have here in the Septuagint, the powers, the dunamis. Yeah, it's a word that Paul's going to use for supernatural powers of darkness. The powers of the heavens will melt, and the heaven will be rolled up like a scroll, and all the stars will fall as leaves fall from a fig tree. Over in Revelation 6:13 and 14, John is going to be using the Septuagint, or at least it looks that way. He says, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs, when shaken by a great wind, and the heaven was split as a scroll having been rolled up. So he draws a little bit from Isaiah 34, and he's going to be looping other passages into it. But it's very clear that he's thinking about celestial catastrophe. And again, the celestial language in Old Testament thought and Second Temple Jewish thought is not always, but frequently used of supernatural powers. And that is certainly the way that Isaiah 34:4 is using this, because it adds this thought to, again, the human armies earlier in the passage. It's very clear that God is going to judge both. At the day of the Lord, the human powers oppressing the people of God are going to get what's coming to them, and so are the spiritual powers going to get what's coming to them. The phrase stars fell from heaven, that is in Revelation 6:13. That's, you can look that up in Matthew 24:29, Mark 13:25. Isaiah 34, verse 4, plays an important role here. Because, we read, it's easy to read through this passage. And again, lots of end time systems do this, the ones that want to see black helicopters and all this. They're only thinking about earthly armies. And again, what I'm saying is, well, some of the language just goes beyond that. Let's not forget that element. So the observation for our purposes is because the Septuagint of Isaiah 34:4 translates the Hebrew all their host, Tseva'am, with dunamis, a term that can describe I'll just quote a lexicon here so people know that I'm not making up. This is Arndt and Gingrich. Dunamis is a term that can describe, quote, a personal transcendent spirit or heavenly agent, unquote. Again, because this language in the Greek includes that semantic, and because he's drawing specifically on Isaiah 34:4, when you go to Revelation 6:13 and 14, he talks about the stars of heaven falling. He's not talking about an asteroid catastrophe. Okay, we're not talking about something NASA can defeat. Again, dispense with the uber literalism. We're talking about the judgment of cosmic powers of darkness, along with suffering and apocalyptic violence on the earth. These two things go together, folks. This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. This is the Daniel 10 worldview. Okay, the powers on earth, behind them are other supernatural powers that are using them, manipulating them, steering things to the ends to which they want. If in Revelation we're describing the judgment of human powers that are persecuting believers, you would think that John wouldn't leave out the judgment of, again, the fallen gods of the Old Testament, the corrupt sons of God, Psalm 82, the princes of the nations, Daniel 10. And what I'm suggesting to you is he's not leaving it out. He knows it, he sees it, and by virtue of his allusions here, he's tracking with it. And this is, we need to be a little more careful in what we read. Now, I want to say a little more about the falling stars language. This is language used in the Second Temple period in Second Temple Jewish literature of supernatural powers in rebellion. You find this elsewhere. That's not just the Septuagint of Isaiah 34:4. For instance, you've got, I'm just a list of references in First Enoch. We'll just use Enoch. We could go beyond Enoch, but here it is. First Enoch 18:13, 21:3, 46:7, 86:3, 88:3, 90:21. All of these use the phrasing about falling stars of the watchers. Okay, supernatural powers in rebellion, or again the fallen gods of the nations. However we want to say that. Nicholsburg in his commentary on First Enoch says this about First Enoch 86:3. He says, in First Enoch 86:1-3, stars are an image for the watchers. And in Daniel 12:3 and First Enoch 104:2, stars and angels may even be identified with one another. An extremely close connection is indicated in First Enoch 82:4-20. Thus, when First Enoch 18:15 speaks of transgressing stars, it is alluding to a variation on the myth of the rebellion of the watchers. Okay, that's Nicholsburg. You know what? You also get wandering star language in the New Testament, do you not? Okay, wandering stars is not, something, again, that, well, I hope NASA noticed that. No, it's language that describes supernatural powers in rebellion, enemies of the people of God. So let's not forget that. Isaiah 34, again, really hits on both of these things. It's an important juxtaposition describing an eschatological judgment that includes the gods of the nations, akin to Psalm 82, along with human powers. So in light of all this, again, it's unwise to assume that what John describes in Revelation 6:13-14 is a meteor shower, near-Earth asteroid impact, or some other literal astronomical cataclysm. The judgment of the powers may in fact be the intended meaning. Now, Beale, again, Beale's not doing anything deliberately divine counsel, okay? But he actually notes this possibility in his own defense of not reading the content of these verses, overly literally. He writes this, he says, the reference to stars, mountains, and islands as symbols of human or divine powers in the Septuagint, the Jewish writings, and the Apocalypse itself would point further to a figurative interpretation. I would agree. Although I like metaphorical better, because figurative makes it seem like, I think a word like figurative for evangelical readers makes it fall into that category. Well, if it's figurative, it's not real then. No, it is. Okay, a metaphor depends. Its coherence depends on something that is, literally real. So, when you get language like this, we have to remember that when Scripture uses metaphorical, symbolic, we'll use the word figurative here to be nice, figurative language, the point is not that we're talking about something less than real. We're talking about something more than real in a physical earthly sense. Okay? Got to keep that in mind. One final note on the altar is in order. As was the case with the 24 elders, there exists, believe it or not, an astral interpretation of this feature. In his Revelation commentary, actually alerts readers to this point, even though he's not going to buy it, but he at least does it. He writes, Boll, he's referencing other scholars. Everybody except Malina is written in German, okay? Boll, Sattler, and Malina remind us that there was a constellation called the Altar, located in the southern sky in the Milky Way. And then he quotes, a few, Greek and Latin, classical texts, Ptolemy, Hipparchus, Eudoxus, so on and so forth. And they, get going down here to what he says here a little bit further. Boll considered the souls clothed in white under the altar to be the stars in the Milky Way, over which the altar constellation is situated. Let me just stop there. Isn't that interesting? You've got in the astronomical interpretation or the astral interpretation, you've got the altar, and underneath it, you've got a series of stars. And stars, of course, is going to be used elsewhere, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, for celestial beings and or believers who have been glorified. Just pointing it out. It's at least on the table here. So Boll considered the souls clothed in white under the altar to be the stars in the Milky Way over which the altar constellation is situated. So in Boll's mind, John is using astral imagery to communicate the same point, about, believers are secure, they're going to be glorified, they're going to be with the Lord, they're going to be part of the council. I mean, the theological endpoints are the same. It's just, what is the metaphorical strategy for communicating the idea? And Boll and Malina and others opt for the astral interpretation. They think that the metaphors are astral in nature. That's all we're saying here. It's just that this perspective is quite neglected when it comes to Revelation commentaries. Obviously, there are exceptions, which is why we're reading this stuff. So he continues. He says, On isn't buying this. This interpretation seems forced, however, since the altar mentioned here in verse 9 is one of the furnishings of the heavenly temple referred to elsewhere in Revelation. And astral deification is not so much as hinted at in the rest of Revelation, although it is certainly known in Jewish apocalyptic. Well, there's a problem here. There's actually two problems here. Owen's opinion that this option seems forced is inconsistent with his own content. I mean, we've quoted him here in prior episodes. The very citation, the very quote I just read you, notes that the temple is heavenly. Okay. Which raises the question as to why the altar could not also be heavenly. It's a heavenly temple, a heavenly altar. Don't they kind of go together? In addition, Daniel 12:1-3 has already been used by John, and those verses do indeed point to deification or identification of the righteous with the stars and therefore with the celestial council. And Owen's been all over that. So he's a little bit internally inconsistent here. It seems strained to presume that John needs to keep repeating the idea with the same words for it to be legitimate. But I guess that's what Owen needs to feel a little more positive toward it. But anyway, at least he brings it up. I mean, to his credit, he brings it up. Others do not. And again, for my money, it's at least on the tables. The question, again, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, is, your theological endpoints are the same. It's just which metaphor or metaphors is John drawing on? To communicate this set of ideas. Is it astral or is it something else? And again, I agree. If you think way back to the very first episode we did on introducing the Old Testament Revelation, I think it was the first episode when I mentioned Malina. Whenever I did that for the first time, I agree with criticisms of his work that he neglects looking for solutions in the Old Testament. That is certainly a flaw, but that doesn't mean that we have to choose between one or the other. It's not an A or a B. Do I choose Old Testament antecedents and metaphors and symbols and verses, or do I choose astral stuff, astral metaphors and Second Temple stuff that uses that kind of content? Do I choose one or the other? It's not a both and. It's an either or it's not an either or. It's a both and. John could be doing both at the same time. He could be moving from one to the other. There's no cosmic rule that says we have to pick a pile, and honestly, there never is. Okay, so we need to have all these things on the table and take a look at them and then just ask ourselves, well, what are the possibilities John could be using this or that or the other thing or combination thereof, or, a lot of this stuff, is floating through his mind, and he's just, he's picking freely, in the way he describes things. And again, this is not to say that John, didn't see certain things. He's recording things that he did see, but it's not like he's writing this stuff, while he's in a trance. That's what he says at the very beginning. I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day. Okay, if that's the case, then this is in part, at least in part, a recollection, and John is trying to communicate what he saw. And so he's also trying to add meaning to what he saw. He's trying to connect with his readers, so that they will understand the implications of what he saw. So it could be, again, we just have to read what he's produced for us in the book of Revelation with all of these things at our disposal. That's my only argument. They should all be on the table. We shouldn't be required or forced to only play in one sandbox as opposed to the other. Just don't see any point to that. But anyway, I would just cautiously suggest, as we wrap up here, that if Revelation 4 and 5 is describing glorified believers being part of the divine council, or at least includes that idea, again, we've spent a lot of time on Revelation 4 and 5, then an astral point of reference could be another layer in John's thinking. While isolating the meaning to Revelation's altar to astral thinking goes too far, Malin is guilty of that. The same can be said for eliminating that possibility altogether. So again, we're going to be doing more of this as we proceed, because there are going to be places where astral stuff might really lend, give us some help here, might really lend some clarity, if we can even use the word clarity of Revelation for basically anything. I'll go back to help. It might help us a little bit. Clarity seems a little too bold. All these things should be on the table. So that's Revelation 6. Again, obviously dipping into Old Testament stuff with not, specific reference, to altar, Zechariah's horses and chariots and all this stuff. But he's also, referencing Old Testament concepts like celestial judgment of the fallen gods. Okay. Like the divine warrior who now is the Lamb. Okay, all of these things are drawn from the Old Testament. They frame what John is trying to communicate and describe in terms of what he was shown. And so the more of this kind of stuff we know, the more apt we will be to not try to parse these things in light of our own modern metaphors or in light of our own modern expectations. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a wise thing, because Revelation was written to a specific audience at a specific time. Let's just call it the first century, looping in both date possibilities here. And the people who are reading it need to understand it. Those are the ones that it was written to. Whatever we say is going on in the text, the people of the first century need to be able to parse this. It's a simple idea. Reading the text in context, and all of these things we've talked about today are part of that context. Lots of things to draw on, and John doesn't limit himself, and so neither should we.
If only there was an astral prophecy book that we could help us understand.
Gosh.
If only there was.
You're getting a bit of it here.
If only there was.
This may be the only way it ever gets out.
I don't know how many hints I have to drop here to get that thing produced, but all right. Yeah. Well, hey, next time it seems like we're going to be dealing with the 144,000. It seems like you've tackled that before, maybe in a Q&A or something. But
yeah, we have dipped into it, and that can be pretty dense. I'm not going to promise just one part there, but we'll try. Okay. Reversing Hermann gets into this a little bit, with the tribe of Dan being omitted and all that stuff. So I'm betting that's probably going to take us 2 times, but we'll see.
All right, sounds good. We'll be looking forward to it. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 372, Revelation 7, Part 1. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, lots of sevens in that title.
Yeah, really. That's true. 370 Revelation 7, Part 1. It must be code for something.
Yeah, some kind of...
It's the key to unlocking the 144,000. That's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. You've tackled that, I believe, in a Q&A before, so I'm interested to hear what more you
and a little
add
bit
to it.
Yeah, a little bit in reversing Hermon, too. What listeners need to do now is record this and play it backwards, and then you'll know.
Ooh, nice. Yeah, if I had sound effects, I would completely put something in there in reverse. But hey, before we get into Revelation 7, I've been meaning to ask you about your thoughts on the new Dead Sea Scroll discoveries that happened a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I've looked around on, there's nothing, at least the last time I looked, on the ASOR blog. That's the American Schools of Oriental Research. I can't really find anything in the academic sources, which isn't unusual because they'll wait until somebody publishes something or is near publication or presents something at one of the universities in Israel and whatnot. I'm betting this November at either SBL or the ASOR meetings that somebody will have a session on this. But the most interesting part to me is that the new stuff is in Greek, which is, again, there are Greek Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not the first time for that. But obviously you'd expect Hebrew, or Aramaic, but these are in Greek, and it's part of what I've been able to find, that there's two fragments, both from Minor Prophets. So Zechariah 8, 2 verses, that's 16 and 17, then Nahum 1, 5 and 6. So the real small fragments, whatnot. So, I found a few pictures. They're just little pieces, but this is typically how they come across stuff. Cave 4 was a few 100,000 of these pieces. If you go up online and get a picture of these, under a few inches of bat dung, guano. So
that's crazy.
They're not all these neat scrolls in jars, like you see in the pictures. A lot of it's this kind of stuff, just little pieces that you got to try to figure out how to join them and whatnot. But if it's biblical stuff, at least you can type it out, run it through a computer, and it speeds up the process rather than just doing it out of your head like they did in the old days. But yeah, it's interesting for sure. I mean, the nice thing is it shows there's stuff still out there, even if it's this small, but there's stuff still out there. Now, if they could only find a way of getting people on the black market to cough up what they have, that would be great. But because I strongly suspect that there's stuff like that just waiting to be sold, even though people nowadays know they've got to be real careful about that, or that they don't want to end up in jail. They want to make their money but not wind up in jail. So who knows? Yeah,
I mean, especially because the robbers have been happening for 60, 70 years. I mean, way before they found the first cave. So I mean, where you think they would have already sold a lot of that stuff?
Yeah, I'm betting they did. Sold it to other people who aren't going to release it to the public. Yeah, private collectors. Okay. I'm sure that's going to be the case. And somebody dies, and look what we found. Going through the house. Yeah. So people can insulate themselves from legal problems and whatnot. But yeah, I'm sure you're right there.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be interesting. It's probably going to be after our lifetime when all this stuff hits, I would think.
Yeah, I would imagine there's going to be something, like that. I don't think it'll take another 100 years to get something of, significance out there, because, people do pass on, they do donate things, they come clean, that happens. So, and even if they can manage to make a deal with someone who will release it to the public, then that other person can always say, I bought it from somebody on the dark web. I don't know who it is, so here it is. I'm not keeping it, but there it is. You know,
If you're
I could see stuff like that happening.
If you're a listener of the Naked Bible podcast out there and you've got this in your private collection, we implore you to reach out to your museum, right, Mike? Or you reach out to us. You know, we'll be happy to facilitate transfer of ownership to a museum or university.
The problem with all this, though, is the propensity of fakery. You know, like the Museum of the Bible got hammered, you know, not too long ago,
right.
you know, for having purchased fakes. And that, I mean, the faking is pretty sophisticated, but it's not hard to know how to do it. It's just, you know, can you get to the materials? Do you have that much patience? You know, that sort of thing to reproduce this kind of stuff. But people are scared. Well, what they do is they'll cut out. We were just watching a couple of weeks ago about something about the Mormon Church and faking Joseph Smith documents, and the guy used for the material on which the writing went. He used the same method as the old, I think it was 60s or 70s novel by Irving Wallace, The Word, because you get these manuscripts in museums and old libraries, and you know, if they can get access to them, a lot of these like codexes that come from 3rd, 4th century, they have blank pages in them. You just cut one out, you know, and walk out with it. You know, you put it between something flat. You know, there you go. So yeah, go ahead and carbon date that puppy all you want. You know, you know, you're going to find out it's, you know, in the 300s AD and it's a new gospel or something. You know that. So that's as old as, you know, Irving Wallace. But you know, people who forge, they know how to find those things that have the extra pages and cut them out. Then it's just a matter of the chemical analysis of the ink, which is, you know, you can get that in any journal article, you know, databases online. They do that kind of analysis, and so you can make the ink. The trick is can you reproduce the handwriting? You know, that's usually where things go awry. Trying to imitate a scribal hand. But the other stuff, the quote unquote scientific stuff, you can fake that. It's not that difficult, at least in terms of what to do.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right, Mike. Well, let's turn our attention back to the Bible and Revelation 7. I know you've talked
back to your encrypted introduction.
Yeah. I wish I had some backwards.
Yeah.
You know, my name is Yurt backwards. Does that mean anything? Yurt. Kind of sounds.
Yeah, well, there is, I don't know if it's the correct spelling, but there are such things as yurts. Is that what you're talking about?
Is that like the tents, the little circle
yeah,
tents?
those round,
yeah,
I think
yurts.
they're round. Yeah, round
I was hoping
things,
something more powerful, like.
Right.
Yeah. But
it's not terribly exotic.
If I'm a circle tent, that's not as exciting. But.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, you're a circle tent. Wow, I'm impressed.
Yeah. It's not very.
Yeah.
I'm going to need you to come up with some kind of Hebrew meaning.
Yeah, Hebrew word for yurt.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, I guess I'm just a number 3. Trey stands for 3, so.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm just 3. But we're in Revelation 7.
It's not quite gematria, but we'll take it. You know,
yeah, we're in Revelation 7 today, Mike. So, what more are you going to teach us about the 144,000 today? Well,
this is part 1, which obviously means we're going to need more time. Don't know yet if we're going to get 3. We're going to get at least 2, obviously. In this episode, you know, we're going to tackle a few sort of, I guess, you know, transparently obvious questions when it comes to, again, repurposing the Old Testament and whatnot. And then in the next episode, we'll get into some of the odder stuff that I've actually written a little bit about, like why is Dan missing from the list of tribes and all that stuff. So we'll get back into that sort of thing and a little bit of interpretive stuff and even here, you know, there's going to be some of that too. But you know, this is what the passage is known for: 144,000. First 8 verses. This is the first of 2 listings of the 144,000, or you know, 2 sections of the book of Revelation that spend any time on them. And so this is what everybody thinks of when you hit Revelation 7. And again, I did, you know, write about this before a little bit in Reversing Hermon. We're going to go beyond that, both in this episode and the next episode. So today we're not going to necessarily get into that or how the story, here's a teaser, how the text, you know, the 144,000 may indeed factor into the Watcher story. Again, I talk about that in Reversing Hermon, but that's for part 2. But again, we'll get a little more detail than we devoted to it there. So let's, for today, just jump into the passage, the first 8 verses. And again, I'm reading from ESV. It says, "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on the earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.' And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel." And then you get the list, 12,000 from Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi or Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin are the 12 tribes in the next 4 verses. They all are 12,000, and they are, quote unquote, sealed. Now, a couple general observations, because we're focused here on what John is doing with the Old Testament. The obvious ones are the tribes and the numbers. Okay, so let's just start with the numbers. What about all this counting? What does it remind you of in the Old Testament? Well, the answer is kind of obvious. It reminds you of census counting. I mean, you get these lists of tribes numbered in the Old Testament, like the book of Numbers. What a surprise. That's immediately sort of what you think of. Now, in his Revelation commentary, this is again volume 2, Revelation 6 through 16, he writes this. He says, "The census is a specific form of list that occurs with some frequency in the Old Testament, where it is used for purposes of taxation." One example, Exodus 30, 11 through 16. Or for labor conscription, 2 Chronicles 2, 17 and 18. For determining the cultic duties and social structure of members of the tribe of Levi, that's Numbers 3 and 4. For determining Israelite descent, you get it in Ezra 2. But most commonly, he says, it is used as a means for determining military strength. And this is Numbers chapter 1, verses 2 through 46. Again, very obvious parallel, if you want it, or kind of a source text for that. Now that suggests, Owen writes, that the census in Revelation 7, 4 through 8 is for military purposes. And that might be a bit of an overstatement, but you could see it in the context of Revelation. And this is where Owen goes. I mean, he lists all these other things that don't really fit. So bad things are coming on, with boots on the ground and all this sort of stuff, lots of conflict. It's an apocalyptic text. So this is a reasonable deduction. Again, he suggests that the census in Revelation 7, 4 through 8 is for military purposes, a possibility that is partially confirmed by the present literary context of this pericope, since, according to Revelation 14, that's the second mention of the 144,000, according to Revelation 14, 3 and 4, the group of 144,000 consists exclusively of adult males who practice sexual abstinence, an ancient Israelite requirement for holy warriors. Again, we're going to get into the characterization of them being male virgins next week, and we get again into more Levitical connections, possibly again having to do with the story of the Book of the Watchers in Enoch. But again, just store that away. For now, again, Owen is noting that this was kind of the practice before as one of the preparations for war. If you didn't have sex with your wife, that sort of thing. So again, he's saying this suggests we have a military context. But he also adds, however, the absence of all military and holy war imagery from Revelation 7, 4 through 8 makes this suggestion doubtful. And so he's pulling back a little bit. The author's insistence on an equal number, 12,000, from each of 12 tribes indicates his interest is in the eschatological restoration of the 12-tribe nation of Israel. The eschatology of the late Old Testament and early Jewish periods emphasized the hope of the restoration of Israel. It's Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 and 5, Isaiah 11, 11 through 16, and lots of passages here. Ezekiel 37, 15 to 23 is sort of a favorite on this podcast. again, he gives you 10, 15 references here to this hope of the restoration of Israel. And specifically, a number of these texts have all 12 tribes included. So that's Owen's, assessment. He angles for the military thing, points that out. Okay, you could see that, but then he backs away and says, restoration seems like a better way to go here. And that's actually going to go better, with what where we'll land next week when we hit the whole thing about the characterization of the 144,000 as sexual virgins and male virgins and all that stuff. Bauckham also sort of pushes back on the holy war, the military context, in his article, The Book of Revelation as a Christian War Scroll. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls as we were chatting before the episode, but one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the more famous ones from the original truckload, is something called the War Scroll. It's 1QM, and this is an apocalyptic war between, I like the phrase gods and men, but you have angels and angelic beings and humans fighting on both the good side and the bad side. That's why it's known as the War Scroll, set in the end times. So Bauckham has this article comparing the Book of Revelation to the War Scroll, and again, calling the Book of Revelation a Christian War Scroll. Now, I've put this article in the protected folder just for anybody who's interested in it. We're not going to go point by point through it, but just so that you have access to it. So Bauckham, though, he says it's a more fruitful trajectory to think about the tribes as opposed to this sort of faint military imagery. So he's going to agree with On. He doesn't really, he acknowledges the military element is there, but doesn't find it that persuasive. So let's talk about the tribes. So this is the second thing that stands out, the tribes and the tribal arrangement. So Bauckham writes this. He says, the list of the 12 tribes in Revelation 7 has several peculiarities which require comment. That's an understatement, believe me. First, the order of the list corresponds to no other extant list of the tribes, period, in the Bible. Okay, this one's unique in terms of its order. Most significant, Bauckham writes, is the fact that Judah heads the list. This is true of Old Testament lists in which the tribes are arranged geographically, moving from south to north, for instance, Numbers 34:19, Joshua 21:4, so on and so forth. But the list in Revelation 7 bears no other resemblance to any of these geographical lists. The only other Old Testament list of tribes which puts Judah first is that of Numbers 2, verse 3, followed by Numbers 7, 12, and 10, 14. That is, the tribes in their military order in the camp. So again, here he is now making this comment about there's a military flavoring to this, but then Bauckham says, but again, the rest of the order of tribes in Revelation 7 bears no resemblance to the list of Numbers 2. And again, he has this, his own pushback about, okay, there's some military stuff in here, but not enough to make him or On, of course, think that this is really what it's about. I don't think we should lose the military context personally. I think it does fit with spiritual warfare. But again, that's for part 2 with the whole Watcher story. I think there's a reason why we get some military sprinkles in the text. But continuing on with Bauckham. So he says that's one peculiarity. The order of the list corresponds to no other extant list of the tribes. Number 2, the inclusion of both Joseph and Manasseh. This is Revelation 7, 6, and 8. Rather than either Joseph alone or Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, let me just stop there. Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's two boys. And so after they're sort of grafted into Israel, the Genesis 48 scene with Jacob, crossing the hands and all that, after they are adopted essentially by Israel, by Jacob, you will often see Ephraim and Manasseh occupying the Joseph slot in the list of tribes. But here you get both Joseph and Manasseh, like what happened to Ephraim. Bauckham actually says here, this is unparalleled and has never been explained. Thanks for that. Then he goes on and he says, a possibility is that the author had in mind Ezekiel 37, 15 through 23, the classic Old Testament prophecy of the reunion of the 12 tribes in the Messianic kingdom. In the extant text of Ezekiel 37, 16, and 19, the name Joseph has been glossed. There's an explanatory item in these verses. The name Joseph has been glossed with phrases referring to Ephraim. in such a way that the reader could think that Joseph is here being used as a name for the tribe of Ephraim. Joseph might therefore seem a suitable name for Ephraim in the list of the tribes in the eschatological reunited Israel. So let me just stop there. So Baucham's saying it's really unusual, and it's unprecedented actually, that you have Joseph and Manasseh in a tribal list and you don't have Ephraim. Then he to summarize what he's saying, well, if you go back in the Old Testament, you're going to find in Ezekiel 37, you're going to find references to Joseph there because Ezekiel 37, the context is the reunification of the tribes. You're going to find Joseph there, but Joseph is talked about in ways that would be associated with Ephraim elsewhere in the Old Testament. So maybe a reader of John's Apocalypse, when he encounters Joseph in the list, will think Ephraim, and therefore you sort of have Ephraim and Manasseh. You have this expected symmetry. Okay, that's a guess, but and Baucham admits it's a guess. He says this has never really been explained by anybody. There you go. Maybe that's what's going on. Third anomaly is the tribe of Levi. Revelation 7:7 might seem out of place in a military census. It was excluded from the two Mosaic censuses. It's hard to say, censuses. In Numbers 1:41, Numbers 2:33, Numbers 26, 1 through 51. Okay, Levi isn't included. And remember, the census in Numbers was, again, this is for warfare because they're going to go in and, that the conquest is going to start. We're going to take the land and all that. But the priestly tribe was excluded from that. But here they're included. It's just a little odd. I mean, in the book of Numbers, they do get numbered, but not as part of the military, engagement party. Okay, and they're not part of the military forces. Baucham adds, however, in 1 QM, that's the war scroll from Qumran, although the priests and Levites do not fight with weapons, they play an essential part in the conduct of war, conducting prayers before, during, and after battle, and blowing the trumpets, which both direct the troops and call divine attention to the battle. Without them, the war could not be a holy war, so they have to participate in some way, he says. Consequently, the tribe of Levi is organized on the same military pattern as the other tribes, in the war scroll anyway, 1 QM 4, 1 through 8, and can be said to fight, in this way. Again, this is sort of like spiritual warfare, which I think is the more fruitful trajectory for all of this. So those are, again, Baucham's, three anomalies that he notes right away when it comes to the tribes. He could have added, well, he does add, I'll just include it here, even though we're going to talk about it next time. Fourth, the omission of Dan. Okay, the tribe of Dan is not in the list in Revelation 7 or later. So the omission of Dan from the list must probably be regarded as arbitrary, Baucham says. Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. Again, part 2, we'll spend more time on that. One tribe was frequently omitted in order to achieve a list of 12. That's true, because after Joseph, you have Ephraim and Manasseh, so the number goes from 12 to 13. So you gotta take one away to get this nice roundabout 12 number. So that's true, but it's still Dan, and Baucham knows all this. So he adds, the tradition that Antichrist was to come from the tribe of Dan, which is first found in Irenaeus, and then Hippolytus, again, these are early patristic writers, is unlikely. Baucham says this tradition is unlikely to be pre-Christian. In other words, he doesn't think it was part of the Jewish mindset, the Jewish cognitive environment at the time. Because or since the Antichrist figures of Jewish apocalyptic are invariably Gentile and pagan. In any case, he says, even this would scarcely account for the exclusion of the whole tribe from the eschatological Israel. So again, to summarize that, he notes the absence of Dan. That's his fourth anomaly. He thinks it's arbitrary. You got to take one out. So why not Dan? It's Dan's turn to be left out. Doesn't think there's anything to it. Again, because he's thinking that this whole idea is something that springs from Christian tradition, even though Christians use the Old Testament to get to this conclusion. He doesn't believe that it's present in Judaism, and so Baucham says, no, I don't think so. Again, we'll spend more time on the omission of Dan in part 2, but again, there's all four anomalies. Now, again, the point for now is that it does seem fair to me that the census lists and the tribal arrangement is, sort of on target. Maybe we don't have too much or an overemphasis on the military side. Maybe it really is about the betrayals and the restoration of the tribes. I mean, I think that's legitimate. That's on target. But I don't think that really means that the military element should just be dismissed or ignored. I think John is using that Old Testament theme as well to portray opposition on earth to the forces of evil, who it's going to turn out in the book of Revelation to be this Antichrist figure in the last days. Again, so I think spiritual warfare is much more in view than anything, again, boots on the ground kind of military engagement. So I think it should remain part of the picture and not just be, set aside. So for the rest of this episode, though, I want to drill down on a couple of other things. Now, one of the sources that I mentioned real early on, we have not used it too much, is Stephen Moyse. It's Moyise. He, in his book on the Old Testament, in the book of Revelation, raises two obvious questions about this chapter. He writes this: the two main questions that arise from John's use of this tradition concern the identity of those protected, the 144,000, and their relation to the great throng of Revelation 7:9. Like, is it the same group or a different group? Let me just go and read that. So after you get the list of the 144,000 in Revelation 7, that list ends with verse 8, and then verse 9 we read this: after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. Then the description continues. But anyway, there are scholars who think that the great throng there is the 144,000, and others, and I'm including myself in this group, don't. I don't think they're from the tribes of Israel. I think that excludes them right away. I think you have two different groups here. But Moyse is saying the two questions are, who are these guys? Who are the 144,000? And what's the relationship to verse 9? And number two, second question, what is it that they are protected from? Okay, so let's take those two in order. So who are the 144,000, this identification? Moyse, again, will start us off again from his same source, his book on the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. He writes this: the sealing of the saints in Revelation 7, 2, and 3 is almost certainly modeled on Ezekiel 9, 4 through 6. So I'm going to read Ezekiel 9, 4 through 6, because he doesn't give you the full passage. He has an excerpt here, but let me just go there and read Ezekiel 9, because again, I think this for sure is John's source material. I'm going to go back and I'm going to start in verse 1, Ezekiel 9, and read through verse 6. Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, bring near the executioners of the city. Okay, if you remember way back in our series on Ezekiel, in chapter 8, you get this vision of the abominations of the temple, all the stuff that the people are doing wrong, and God is angry and so on and so forth. And so Ezekiel hears the voice of God. He cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen, and with a writing case at his waist. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing case in his waist. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him, after the first guy, and strike. Your eye shall not spare, you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, children and women, and touch no one on whom is the mark. And I begin at my sanctuary, with the priests. So they began with the elders who were before the house. That's first 6 verses. So you have this judgment scene in Ezekiel, again, basically for the thoroughgoing apostasy, not only of the priesthood and the temple, but the whole city. So Moyse says it's pretty hard to not see this as John's point of reference. So he writes, and he quotes this passage, go through the city, through Jerusalem, put a mark on the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. Right? Touch no one who has the mark. And then he compares that with Revelation 7, 2, and 3. I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to damage earth and sea, saying, do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have marked the servants of our God, and with a seal on their foreheads. So Moïse says later tradition identified this sealing either with baptism, the laying on of hands, or the marking of the cross. This is later Christian tradition. And perhaps Paul's use of sphragidzane. It's a specific verb in 2 Corinthians 1:22. It means to certify or seal. So 2 Corinthians 1:22, Ephesians 1:13, Ephesians 4:30. And Moïse says Paul's use of sphragidzane in these passages made this later tradition inevitable. Nevertheless, he says, it seems clear that John's meaning is closer to Ezekiel's. I mean, Paul, let me just butt in here. Paul doesn't have sealing going on for some sort of purpose that would kind of align with the sealing of Ezekiel 9. Like that they're not being protected physically from something. Okay, and Paul. So Moïse is saying John seems to be going the same direction as Ezekiel. He's not doing he's not tracking with Paul, he's tracking with Ezekiel. So he keeps writing and says, again, it seems clear that John's meaning is closer to Ezekiel's, namely that God's people are to be given a special mark to protect them from the approaching slaughter. One further point of interest is that the sealing episode is followed by an angel reaching into the altar and hurling fire onto the earth. Quote, then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, Revelation 8:5, unquote. A similar thing follows Ezekiel's account of the sealing. Quote, this is 10:2. He said to the man clothed in linen, go within the wheelwork underneath the cherubim, fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city. Unquote. So Moïse is saying, look, even this element's there. So it would seem clear that the sealing is drawn from a Jewish text, Ezekiel 9, and wider Jewish context, the tribes and the census. Arguably the main factor in the identity of the 144,000, again, being the tribes, the restoration of the tribes. So On, again, is aware of all this, and he notes as much, but he sort of adds a little twist. So let me add his thought here. He says, many who think that Revelation 7:4-8 is based on a Jewish source hold that while the 144,000 may have originally referred to Jews or the real Israel, i.e. the ethnic Israel, that source has been reinterpreted by the author, John, to refer to a different group, such as the Christian church or Christian martyrs. There are others, however, who think that whether or not Revelation 7:4-8 is based on a Jewish source, the text in its present context refers to Jews. So right there you have a difference of opinion. And On lays it out. Even though this goes back to Ezekiel 9, he says some scholars think John's reinterpreting it and applying it to Christians. And then there are others who would say, nope, these are all Jews. The 144,000 are Jews. They're not Gentile, in other words. See, and catch the way I said that. Because right away, even in the academic discussion, there's an odd mixing up or conflation of the term Christian and Jew. Okay, a Christian. Look, you can still be a Christian, you can still be a believer and be a Jew or a Gentile. But historically, again, in the history of interpretation, scholars have looked at this and saying, oh, ethnic Jews, that's one group. The other one says, nope, they're Christian church. Well, can't they still be Jews? I mean, if they're followers of Jesus, aren't they Christians anyway? But again, it seems like a lot of people don't even ask that question, which is kind of shocking, to be honest with you. But On is correct here. These are the two sides that historically have been taken. 144,000 are Jews. 144,000 are not Jews. So like it's this black and white either or thinking. And I'm going to end up objecting to this as we go on. So I think you can already tell that. But that's typically how this is laid out. So On goes into, okay, why does each side take its position? What are the arguments? Should we stick with the context of Ezekiel 9, Jews, or should we do something different with it? Okay, should we assume that John is altering it when he uses it, or is John being consistent again with his use of it? Where do we fall out here? So On writes this. He says there are several arguments that proponents of this view, as far as the Jewish view, put forward. A, the detailed enumeration of 12,000 sealed from each of the 12 tribes of Israel suggests that Jews or Jewish Christians are in view. See, now he throws that in. That's his safety net. Jews or Jewish Christians are in view. Okay, but they're still ethnic Jews. And I'm actually going to agree with that qualification. I think they are ethnic Jews, but I also think they're followers of the Lamb. They're believers. They're Christians. Okay, so let's try to keep the terminology straight here. So his first argument, again, for that view is, look, 12,000 from each tribe. Okay, that's what's in view. For while the 12 tribes in dispersion, James 1:1, for instance, can be used in a Christian context to represent the whole Christian church, inclusive of Gentiles, he says. A detailed enumeration of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes does not lend itself easily to allegorization, which is, I don't know why he calls it that, but okay, we'll just let him go. B, his second argument, since the author is undoubtedly a Jewish Christian, it is not particularly surprising that he would have envisioned a special role in the eschaton for Christians of Jewish origin. That's easy enough. Paul struggled with the problem of the rejection of the gospel by most Jews in Romans 9 through 11. Recognizing that not everyone descended from Israel belongs to the true Israel, Romans 9:6. Yet, nevertheless, Paul held out the eschatological hope that Israel would eventually be converted, Romans 11:25 through 27. The eschatological tradition of the future gathering of Israel and the Gentiles at the New Jerusalem at the coming of Christ is found elsewhere in early Christian literature. See, now here he's getting confusing because now he's looping the Gentiles in. I don't know why he does this. What I want you as the listener to know, look, here are your options for the 144,000. All ethnic Jews having nothing to do with their status as Christians, which doesn't seem possible, okay? Because they're followers of the Lamb. The Lamb is Jesus. Second is they're all Christians with no Jewish ethnicity. Again, to me that's possible, but it doesn't seem right. To me, that the better option is, okay, they're Jews, they're ethnic Jews, but they're Christians too. We don't have to have the Gentiles in the picture because, again, my view that you're going to hear in a moment is when you get to verse 9, the massive multitude from every tribe, every nation, those are the Gentiles. Okay, so and these two groups, the 144,000 and the massive group in Revelation 7:9, they're on the same side. It's just two different ways of talking about the composition of the people of God. So to me, this doesn't seem like so much of a dilemma. But I want you to hear the academic discussion, because even the academic discussion is like, well, you say one thing, then you say another, then you mix the two, and it just gets really confusing, where I don't think it really has to be that confusing. So on keeps going on, and then he's going to talk about the other view. Okay, the one that sort of, I think, should we say, lands on this, they're all Christians. Really, there's nothing to see here with Jewish ethnicity. So opponents of the first view have proposed a number of arguments against interpreting the 144,000 as Jews or Jewish Christians. So this second view wants to see them as as the church, mixture of Jew and Gentile, and no attention is being drawn. The second view says that the church is the new Israel anyway, so Jewish ethnicity is not even part of what's going on here. So those who defend that view say the 12 tribes did not literally exist in the first century AD. I mean, nobody knew their tribal affiliation. Okay? And the hope of their eventual restoration belonged not to the real, but to the ideal world. Against this objection, On's going to push back here because he doesn't buy this, and neither do I. So I'm going to let you have it here with him. Against this objection, it can be countered that Josephus, writing at the end of the first century, reckoned with the existence of 12 tribes in his day. So Josephus would have disagreed. Well, we do have people here who know what tribe they're from here in the first century. And Josephus, talked about the widespread eschatological hope of the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, which was certainly based on the assumption of their actual existence in the world. Why else would you hope for it? If there were no tribes at all, nobody knew what are you talking about tribes for? Well, then it wouldn't have been a big item of discussion in terms of the apocalyptic literature, the religious literature, but it was. Secondly, the distinction between Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, common in the early decades of the apostolic age, was no longer current at the end of the first century. Again, I doubt that too, and so does On. He says, against this position, it may be argued that the debate between Christianity and Judaism continued well into the 2nd century, as is evident in Barnabas and the dialogue of Justin Martyr. Third, so many of the ways of describing the real Israel have been applied to the church in Revelation that it would be perverse to treat Revelation 7:4-8 as an exception to the rule. To this, it may be replied that while certain Old Testament language used of Israel is applied to Christians, okay, Christians are called, just generally, the church, believers generally are called a kingdom and a kingdom of priests, an allusion to Exodus 19:6. Again, this is found in Revelation 1:6, 5:10, so on and so forth. Sure, that happens. But Owen says the use of other traditional language in Revelation suggests that the church is constituted of both Jews and Gentiles, i.e. the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem bear the names of the 12 tribes, the sons of Israel, while the 12 foundations of the city bear the names of the 12 apostles. And so in other words, he's saying, look, they're on the same side, but there are passages that distinguish them too. So don't just, jam all of them together. So these are the two sides. Now, On is on the side that these 144,000 either are ethnic Jews or Jewish Christians, and that's my position is that they're Jewish Christians. Okay, this would seem coherent in light of the transition at Revelation 7:9. So On is going to argue for this, and I'm in agreement with him. He says there are striking differences between the two groups described in Revelation 7:4-8, the 144,000, and Revelation 7:9-17, the rest of the chapter, that have to be borne in mind. Number one, there's a clear contrast between the specific enumeration of the 144,000 and the, quote, vast size of a great multitude, which, quote, no one was able to number. Well, it can't be the same because they just numbered them back in verses 4-8. So how does it make any sense to say that the massive group in verses 9-17 is the same as the 144,000? Well, it doesn't. The latter is obviously a much larger group than the former, and therefore very probably a different group. Second, On says, the 144,000 are composed of 12,000 drawn from each of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel, while the members of the great multitude, in explicit contrast, according to verse 9, are drawn from, quote, every nation and tribe and people and language group, unquote. Again, it's very obvious. Third, the 144,000 are apparently located on earth, while the innumerable multitude is in heaven, before the throne of God, Revelation 7:11. Again, that's pretty obvious too. Fourth, in Revelation 7:4-8, the 144,000 are in a situation of imminent peril that requires protective sealing, while the innumerable multitude of 7:9-17 has passed victoriously through the great tribulation and has received a heavenly reward. Obviously, they weren't sealed because they're dead. All right. They've suffered, okay? So for my money, it makes more sense to have the 144,000 as Jews who are also Christians. They're loyal to the Lamb. They are Christians, but the Old Testament orientation suggests they should not be thought of as Gentiles. Gentiles are not included in this group. Again, they're not spiritual Israelites. They're Jews who follow the Lamb. Everything about Revelation 7:1-8 is Jewish and Old Testament in context. What does John repurpose? The census stuff, the tribes, and Ezekiel 9. I mean, everything is pointing this direction. So again, in part 2, we're going to also throw in Levitical elements here as well when we get to, again, the whole issue of how does this possibly connect to the Watcher story. So I think Revelation 14 also is consistent with this. This is the other passage with 144,000, our mention. I don't see a contrast between that 144,000 and this 144,000. Again, some scholars argue the two groups are different, asserting that the 144,000 in Revelation 14 cannot be Jews, which makes zero sense in my mind. The only possible basis for such a conclusion is that the 144,000 in Revelation 14 are not listed by tribes. Okay, well, why would John need to do that twice? He's already done it once. Again, Revelation 7, why does he have to do it again? Again, this is John. He's not that neat. I mean, we've seen this countless times already. John just assumed, the same guy that assumes that you're going to be able to pluck out the 4 or 5 phrases from 4 or 5 different books of the Old Testament and know what he's doing with it and why, he probably expects you to remember something 7 chapters ago in the same document that he's writing. So to me, this is really a lame, sort of trajectory to try to distinguish one group from the other. The other thing that it says, well, the ones in chapter 14, they follow the Lamb. Well, so do these. I mean, lots of ethnic Jews followed the Lamb, followed Christ. Doesn't mean they aren't Jews. They don't lose their ethnicity. Again, this whole objection seems to confuse a spiritual label, Christian, okay, follower of the Lamb, with an ethnic one, Jew. None of this, again, requires the notion that John intends to keep Jewish and Gentile believers separate, because elsewhere he's going to put everybody together in one people of God and so on and so forth. So my advice here, my little end times system jab of the day is pretty simple. Look, don't take the 144,000 and use their Jewish ethnicity to argue for a particular end time system that keeps the Jew, the Jewish believer, absolutely separate from the Gentile or the circumcision neutral thing we call the church, because John is going to join them elsewhere. Okay, and vice versa. Don't, for another end time system, take the merging passages and argue against the separation passages. This is typically what's done with end time systems. People pick the trajectory on which their system works best, and then they look back at the places where it doesn't work and they call them problem passages. Okay, let's just not do that. So Beale, again, gets into this a little bit. I'm not going to read everything that Beale has because, Beale, well, maybe I should, because Beale wants everything to be the church, right? He's Reformed, he wants everything to be the church. So I'll just read you what he has here. He says, some commentators understand the number 144,000 as literal and conclude that those who are sealed are a remnant of the ethnic Israelites. Again, why does it have to be that way, Dr. Beale? Why can't it be a group of Jewish Christians? But anyway, to be fair to him, this is how it is articulated, so that is fair. So the number of them conclude that must be a remnant of ethnic Israelites. This is a typical dispensational approach, for instance, which Beale is not. He says this is based on the presupposition that John's language is to be understood literally except where he states explicitly otherwise. It is also usually based on the futurist understanding of the book's structure. That's dispensationalism, according to which Revelation 4:1 all the way through 22:5 refers only to a future tribulation immediately preceding Christ's second coming. Accordingly, Revelation 7:4 through 8 is said to allude to a group of ethnic Israelites who come to believe in Christ during this tribulation period. So in other words, they're not even believers when they're sealed. They come to believe in a dispensational system, or at least some of them anyway. And then they'll get protected from martyrdom during it. It's unwise, again, to take the separation aspects, argue one end time system, and then ignore the places where they're merged. I'm sorry, but Old Testament imagery, like the kingdom of priests, the Old Testament passages about ethnic Israel are applied to all believers in the book of Revelation, in the letters to the churches, where very clearly they're not just Jews there. Okay? That does happen in the book. So let's not just skip those to create our system and then call them problem passages or just ignore them. That's cheating. Okay, don't do that. This is why I say again, we'll add this to the very long list of how all systems of eschatology cheat somewhere. They just do. It's just that's just the way it is. So I would, again, I'm going to skip a little bit here to what Beale says elsewhere. Again, Beale wants everything to be the church here. It should be obvious from this that the separation of Jews and Gentiles as believers must be married to assumptions about Revelation, describing a future tribulation period. So Beale notes, some commentators link Revelation 7:3-8 to the prophecy in Romans 11:24 through 26, that all ethnic, again, this is an assumption that he's shooting at, all ethnic Israel will be saved at Christ's second coming. Most holding this view attach figurative significance to the number 144,000. So isn't this wonderful? I mean, I'm glad I included this because, look, do you realize what I just read there? Beale is, and again, I grew up in this tradition, and this actually does, you will actually read this, you actually encounter this, that there are going to be those who say, look, Revelation 7 is only Jews, and they're going to come to know the Lord or whatever during the tribulation, because the tribulation is against the Jew because the church has been raptured. Okay, and this is a fulfillment of Romans 11:24 through 26 that all Israel will be saved. So on the one hand, they're looking at it literally, that the 144,000 are literally ethnic Jews, but then when they go to Romans 11. They can't be literal there because it says all Israel. And here in Revelation 7, you got 144,000. So we don't like the subset because Romans 11 says all Israel. So the number of the passage we're taking literally must be figurative. Ta-da! So basically you get to argue your position from the same passage where part of it is literal and the other part's figurative. Just pardon my spasm. This is why I dislike eschatology so much, because I don't like cheating with outliers. I don't like cheating method. That's what this is. And, it's not just, that particular, end time system. You get it on the other side too, with assumptions about the church being the Israel as opposed to a new Israel, and the terminology matters. I mean, we've had podcast episodes on this before. The text does both, folks. It does both things, because the one people of God is composed of two units, we'll call them. You have ethnic Jews who follow Jesus, and you have Gentiles who follow Jesus. They are two different things, but collectively they are one. So let's just own that. And when they become one, their ethnicity isn't erased. The fact that the two become one doesn't mean that God has there isn't a single element, eschatologically speaking, of any of God's plans for national Israel. Again, how do we know that? There are certain passages that seem to suggest it. How about Armageddon? Again, it's a battle for Jerusalem. I would suggest that Jerusalem is in Israel. There are just things like this that seem ethnic Israel focused. There's a lot that isn't, because of the one new man idea, the one people of God. But there's still these outliers, and we need to let the outliers be outliers. We need to affirm both, rather than find some way to make them disappear and be grafted in. You see what I did there with Romans? They're grafted into our theological system, and it's just tactically, it's just not another Jewishism. It's not kosher. It just isn't. Anyway, but this is what you get with 144,000 discussions. So let's go down a little bit here. Beale wants, again, to have everything be the church. He says if Gentile believers are clearly identified together with the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel as part of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21:12 and 14 and 24, and Revelation 22:2-5, then it is not odd that John should refer to them together with Jewish Christians in Revelation 7:4 as the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. Well, okay, that's coherent in that you can see how he gets there, but it's not conclusive. Why can't we allow John to do both? Why does it have to be one or the other? There's one family of God, and it's a point of factuality that in the early church and New Testament theology, the one family derived from Jewish believers and Gentiles. There's no cosmic law that says that John can't talk about the one family in both ways. Okay, for example, Acts does it all the time, as do the epistles. Jewish believers and Gentile believers. Okay, there's still one church. When Paul talks about Jews who follow Jesus, then he talks about his Gentile, friends. Did he just say that he doesn't believe that the church is one? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. Why can't John be talking both ways about the same single entity as well? The honest answer is there's no rule against it. The only thing against it is the effort to prop up a system. That's what's against it. Why not apply the already but not yet? Why not? Why not? If the Lamb in the book of Revelation is risen and ruling in some way but not enthroned until Revelation 21, we've seen this in a prior episode, why is it not reasonable to think that John delays the full picture of Gentiles being identified with the 12 tribes until Revelation 21 as well? Can't John do that? Can it be already but not yet? Again, my view is, yeah, it can. It can. So I don't find Beale's arguments persuasive here either. Second question, we got to keep moving here. Are the 144,000 specifically protected? Are they specially protected? Again, no surprise, you get more than one view of this too. So some samples are in order. Beale writes this: why God seals his servants is debated. The main alternatives are, number one, for protection from physical harm. Number two, for protection from demons. Number 3, for protection from losing their faith and hence their salvation. Okay, so Beale says, basically he's saying I've encountered all 3 of these reasons here. Moyes, again, bring him back into discussion. He writes this at the same question about the special protection. As to the sealing of the 144,000, it does not appear to be protection against physical attacks. So he's out of the gate denying that it's protection against anything physical, given that they have already had to endure the effects of the first 6 seals, which is kind of an assumption. Neither is it likely to be protection against death, since Revelation consistently portrays martyrdom as the way to victory. Charles, that's R.H. Charles, who was the big New Testament and Enoch scholar of a century ago. Charles thinks it is protection against the satanic forces about to be unleashed, and he cites Revelation 9, the abyss passage, though one might have expected it to come directly before this instead of before the trumpets. So, Moyes is saying, the difference of opinion here. Let's loop him in, sees things in a different way. He acknowledges, the other perspective. He says the seal of God explicitly provides special protection for the wrath of God that is coming upon the world. And he cites Revelation 9:4. There is no explicit indication that the sealed are not protected from the wrath of the ungodly, even though this is the claim of many commentators. In many early Christian texts, the eschatological tribulation was thought to be a present feature of Christian experience in the world, and no distinction was made between plagues and punishments sent by God upon humankind and the hostility and persecution inflicted on Christians by Jews. So there's your spectrum of opinion. Now, I think, for my money, I think Beale's note, he has a note about Ezekiel 9, and I think it's pretty decisive here, though with one qualification. So Beale writes this. Beale's the only one of these 3 that loops Ezekiel 9 into the protection question, oddly enough. He says Ezekiel 9 is often correctly proposed as the best background for the divine sealing, and I would agree. There God commands an angel to put a mark on all genuine believers, but instructs other angels to slay unfaithful Israelites. The mark on believers is to protect them from the coming wrath, which will be inflicted by the Babylonians and which unfaithful Israelites will suffer. Ezekiel 9, like Ezekiel 14, 20, or 12 through 23, apparently speaks of the physical protection of the righteous remnant within Israel, who have been purged from the unfaithful by the fire of judgment. This is confirmed by the same function of the mark of blood over the Hebrews' doors at Passover. So he loops Passover in here, Exodus 12, which may stand behind Ezekiel 9 itself. He's saying Passover might actually be behind Ezekiel 9, as well as behind Revelation 7, as is evident from the fact that the seal protects believers from the harmful effects of the following trumpet and bowl plagues, which have been modeled on the Exodus plagues. Let me just stop there. You see why I think this is decisive. It's like he's looping Passover in here because the next chapter is going to do that. As the trumpet and bowl, judgments get rolled out here in the book of Revelation, the 144,000 are going to be protected from them just as the faithful Israelites were at Passover. And it matters for this question that those judgments, the trumpet and bowl plagues, are modeled after the plagues of Exodus, the book of Exodus, leading up to the Passover, the death angel. So Beale's saying, look, you got to consider all this data. Back to him, he says, spiritual protection of the Israelite faithful may also be included in these 2 Old Testament texts. Whichever may be the case in Ezekiel or Exodus, uppermost in John's mind is certainly not physical security, but protection of the believer's faith and salvation from the various sufferings and persecutions that are inflicted on them, whether by Satan or by his demonic or earthly agents. Do you see what Beale just did there? He builds this physical argument about protection, modeled after the association with the plagues, and then he turns away from it, and now he makes it spiritual protection. I just want you to be as frustrated as I am. Okay. Because it's like, man, you're just right there. You're right there. You got Ezekiel 9, you got the Passover, you got the plagues, and Goshen and all this stuff. Okay, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect parallel or even a perfect argument, but there's obviously a physical element at least in here. And then he just turns around and goes the other direction. And ultimately Beale's going to argue that this is, protection from spiritual forces, and he's a Calvinist, so he doesn't, think that has a very low view of what he thinks is the concept of losing salvation here. So he's going to use this material against that. So it's really unsatisfying that he does such a nice job of providing some Old Testament context for a physical element and then just doesn't go there. It's just odd. If protection here means protection from, losing faith, then he has to see the 144,000 as the whole church, which is his view. Again, from a few minutes ago, he doesn't want to see them only as Jewish believers. He wants to see it as the whole church. And if you do that, then you're going to look at it this way, that we're protected from apostasy here, spiritual attacks and so on and so forth. But the very data that he uses could be used to go the other way. So I just, again, it's a little unsatisfying as to what is done with this material. I think to sum up here, I think the best way to look at the 144,000 is, again, these are ethnic Jews. I think John's description is deliberate. I think he's using the census, the tribes, Ezekiel 9, again, as a parallel to them. He loops, the biggest argument for me is Revelation 7:9, because it's very clear that the group that is in verses 9 through the end of the chapter is different than the one in the first 8 verses. First 8 verses, very clear Old Testament, i.e. Israelite Jewish elements there to portray this group. And after that point, verse 9 and onwards, you don't have any of that. Every tribe, every people, every language, every nation, and it can't be numbered. So how can it be that, how can it be what you see in the first 8 verses? Doesn't make any sense to me. So if you have this distinction, to me that opens the door to not only Ezekiel 9 being about some sort of physical protection there, but also I think Beale's observations about Passover are legit. Now, if you think about the Exodus plagues, okay, let's just not all of them, sort of totally exempted the Israelites. After all, the last one, death of the firstborn, they had to go into their house, they had to put the blood on the lintel. I mean, otherwise they would have died. So there's no necessary immunity there. You gotta do what the Lord tells you to do to avoid physical harm. You have to take that mark, okay, on the house, house door, doorposts and lintel. So there's that element of the plague of darkness. I mean, when we went through Exodus, I pointed out that in some of these, it's very clear that Israel didn't suffer whatever the plague was. But in other cases, that's not said, or it would be almost impossible to see how it could be like the plague of darkness. It's dark, okay? I mean, there's no spotlight shining on Goshen. I mean, you never see that. So even with those qualifications, though, there's clearly at least an element of physical protection in the plague accounts that I do think, because as we keep going through Revelation, what happens to people, and the 144,000 are now part of this group, what happens to them is modeled after the plagues. And some of those, the believers did not suffer them. So I think you've got to just honor that rather than just saying, oh, it's all about, losing your faith or something like that. No. Why? Again, why marshal the argument and eliminate that possibility? For sure, it's spiritual warfare. Okay, that's going to be obvious. Any threat to have somebody, surrender the faith, or become, go drift off into unbelief. Of course, that's a spiritual, warfare issue. Of course. And you're going to get demonic forces that are described in the book of Revelation. Of course. But why is it that we sort of run from some of these other elements? I don't think it's very consistent. I think the other reason why Beale does it is because, again, he wants to move as far away as he can from, let's be honest, cartoonish interpretations of the book of Revelation. I get that, but that really isn't an excuse to deny the parallels that you've just helped us see. Why would you do that? I mean, give me a good reason. Here's this reason I understand. You don't want to, again, go to fantasy land here. But on the other hand, they're still there. The parallels are still there. So why must we cancel that out? Why can't we just hold that up and say, look, this could be an element right here? Now, again, if you're looking at the book of Revelation as something already fulfilled, or at least 99% fulfilled in the first century, i.e. with the temple destruction 70 AD, well, then you can't you really can't do anything with the parallels to the Exodus plagues. Where would the evidence be that Jews who followed Jesus were protected when the Romans came into town and destroyed the temple? I mean, I don't know where you're going to argue that. So that, that sort of takes that away from you. But for anyone who's not in that position, a non-preterist view, and who wouldn't be sort of seeing any of this, or who's willing to see at least some of this be like a boots on the ground, reality. Maybe not Hal Lindsey or something like that, okay? But if you're at least willing to see, again, real-time stuff in what's in the content of the book of Revelation preceding the second coming and all that, it would seem to me that this still has to be on the table. This possibility at least. Let's just call it a possibility at least, that our examination of the Old Testament and its connections into Revelation renders this a possibility as far as how to look at things. So I think we need to let it there. Just leave it there and not try to argue it away or cancel it out, because I think the text opens that door and leaves it open. I don't think there's any way to successfully exegetically cancel it out. So that's all I'm trying to say. So next time we're going to get into part 2, and we'll hit the elements of Revelation 7 that get into the whole issue of how this might relate to the Book of the Watchers. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, you're going to know some of the source material I'll take us back into there. The Dan and the Antichrist thing, we'll get into that a little bit more. So that'll be what we cover in part 2, and we should be able to wrap up Revelation 7 in that second part.
All right, Mike, we've got our homework to read Reversing Hermon again. So that's...
Just rush right out there and buy.
That's right. If you don't have it, you need to get to Amazon and buy Reversing Hermon right now.
Get it before Amazon pulls it, right?
Absolutely. And get it before the next episode. So there's your homework.
Yeah.
All right, Mike, looking forward to the next episode. I always love it when we get into the Watchers. Watchers are some of our favorite topics. I don't know why we like them so much, but maybe we should.
Yeah, well,
maybe.
What can I say? I mean, I understand. I understand, but it's still a little creepy. But
Yeah.
There we go.
Exactly. All right, Mike. We'll be looking forward to part 2 next week. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 373, Revelation 7, part 2. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, what's going on?
Well, we have had a new development here in Florida.
Okay.
My wife, Drina, has declared war on 2 ducks in our backyard. The ducks like to land in the pool and do what ducks do. Okay, they poop in the pool. They walk around the sidewalk and poop on the sidewalk. They eat this. There's nothing in the pool to eat, but they eat the seeds that drop from a bird feeder near the pool. So it's funny. This morning, it's been like every morning for a week now. Okay, first thing she does, get out of bed, look out the window. The ducks are here again. She's gone.
What do you do? Shoot them away? I mean, because she shoot them away.
No. I mean,
or they just look at her like, lady, this is my pool.
You got to sort of get. Yeah, they do. You got to sort of get after them. I mean, they won't respond just to yelling, or even barking. The dogs will go out there and bark at them. But if you get the skimmer after them, then they'll fly away. So we've looked it up, and the thing that is recommended that boats do to keep birds off like yachts, from landing on the yachts and stuff like that, and doing the same thing, is to get a rubber snake, and put that by the pool or in the pool. So we're going to try that. and see if that's a duck deterrent. I mean, we've got the owl there for the raccoons. That keeps the we haven't had a raccoon show up for a couple of months now. So the owl works for the raccoons, but the ducks could care less.
Yeah.
So they need another predator. Threat.
Yeah, snakes will do it. I remember my grandparents at their carport, they had a bunch of rubber snakes tied up around their carport, I guess to keep the birds off too. So that memory just popped in my brain right now when you said that. So that's good. So where are you going?
And of course, my kids think Dreen is the villain. Oh, the ducks are so pretty. Let the ducks alone. It's like the ducks are pooping in the pool. Okay, so let's get rid of the ducks. So I'm on Dreen's side, obviously. I don't want ducks pooping in the pool, but it is funny. I have to admit that.
Yeah. Did you name the ducks?
No, we haven't named them yet.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good idea. If I bring that up though, tonight maybe, I'm sure we'll get some candidates.
Well, let us know where y'all land, because
yeah, no pun intended, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cute.
We'll see if the ducks are there a week from now.
Yeah.
She's going to go out and get the rubber snake. And I got to tell her, look, don't get a little one. Like, get something 5-6 feet long so that they don't miss it, and just leave it out there and see if it works.
Yeah. Doesn't Florida, don't y'all have a ton of like wild pythons and whatnot roaming around?
I'm sure there's, I'm sure there's some. I mean, the kids have seen some, one or two on the trails, because by the walking trails here, there's water. These, I don't know if you even call them a creek, but they flow. There's a lot of ponds around here, so you'll see them every now and then. Yeah. But they scatter. Yeah. They're not really a threat unless you do something stupid like try to chase one down. But you'll see them every now and then.
Yeah, we have a pool too, and only thing we get now and then are frogs and turtles. So I'll open the basket covers, and you'll just see turtles, little baby turtles in there spinning. And so we tried to we tried to keep them. We actually made a little turtle habitat kind of outside in our backyard in the attempts to raise them and grow them. But these little baby red ear sliders, I think they're called, they keep escaping. And of course, they're not going back into the pool. I don't know where they're going, but they're disappearing on us. But we've had a couple of frogs, and trying to catch a frog. Have you ever seen a frog swim underwater? It's amazing how good a swimmer they are. Yeah, but I'm trying to catch them with their net, and their little frog legs are kind of freaky the way they swim, and it's just, I don't know, something about trying to catch a frog as it's swimming full speed is kind of weird.
Well, if this doesn't work, I don't know what we're going to do. I'll suggest graduating to a little gator, maybe a little 1 or 2 foot. I'm just kidding, because they're going to poop in the pool too.
Little pet gator. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe you can get a little statue, like a little gnome gator or something. Maybe that'll keep the ducks out.
Yeah. We'll try the gnome. Okay.
Yeah. There you go.
Just the regular gnome. I don't know that would work, but yep. So that's the latest. We have a duck problem.
Good stuff. That's good stuff. I don't know how we switch gears into the end times with that, but part 2 of chapter 7.
We do not have 144,000 ducks. How's that? There we go.
Have you ever seen those deals? If you would, what would you rather fight? Like 144 ducks? I can't. What is that? How's that go? Or like one big? Or would you rather fight one human-sized duck, or would you rather fight like 144 little ducks? What would you rather fight?
Yeah, I'll take the human-sized duck, because you only got to use one bullet on it.
Okay. Oh, well, okay. I didn't say weapons were allowed, but okay, I see what you did there.
Well,
you had to go hand to hand.
hand to wing. Okay.
Yeah. Hand to beat.
That's still my choice.
Okay, good. So
the other one's too labor intensive. It's just there's too much work there.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I'm going to leave it up to you to transition here, because it's all you.
Right. Well, okay, we'll just do it the simple way. We are back in Revelation 7. This is part 2, and we are talking about the 144,000. This time, we sort of just went through the passage last time, talked about different features of it, the number and whatnot, and, just sort of different lines and things that pop up as you read through, especially, the tribal arrangement, the Old Testament connections back to this sort of thing, the number, the census thing, and the tribes and whatnot. Whether they're protected or not, we sort of telegraphed that when we get to the point about, the plagues being unleashed, that there's an allusion here in this chapter to that, and then that, of course, factors into the issue with the plagues of Egypt and were the Israelites protected, and if they were, the 144,000 protected. So we did some of that in part 1. And we reserved part 2 sort of for, different topical approaches to this. And what we talked about last time was I alluded to the fact that when we get to part 2, we're going to talk about a possible connection with the Book of the Watchers. That's, first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch. And also the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And by the end of going through those two things, we actually will sort of also pick up a little bit of, related to how this chapter is used or maybe shouldn't be used or something like that in regard to certain points of end times schemes or scenarios that people will be familiar with today. So I want to get into the Book of Watchers connection first. We're just going to take, that and then the Antichrist from Dan idea, and then sort of mop up chapter 7 in this episode. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, my book, there's going to be some of this content in that book, but we're going to say a few more things about this issue, this possible connection, give you a little more detail here than I do in the book. And we'll do the same thing with the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And when I get to the Antichrist from Dan tradition, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful because, believe it or not, this is a trajectory in my third novel. So I got to be a little cagey with that, but we'll step around that when we get to it here. So Book of the Watchers connection, Revelation 7, 1 through 8, of course, is the 144,000. And then there's another passage in which the 144,000 are mentioned. And this is the passage where there might be, again, some scholars argue for a possible connection back to the Book of the Watchers idea, or at least, more broadly, the events of Genesis 6. Okay. So in Revelation 14, 1 through 5, that's the second passage, we read this. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Again, this is ESV. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne, and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So that's Revelation 14, 1 through 5. You see already, in the very first verse there, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, with him 144,000 who had his name, the Lamb's name, and his father's name written on their foreheads. So there we have the bearing the name concept, which should be familiar to this audience, through, Carmen Imes's work, and we've had her on the podcast, and we've talked about this before, that how this relates to imaging God, and these two concepts go together. Carmen's focus, of course, is Old Testament material, but, she drifts into the New Testament as well in her book, Bearing the Name. And this is representation. And in this, one of the specific Old Testament contexts is the high priest. So right away for a Jew listening to this, they're going to associate this language with broadly Israelites bearing the name of Yahweh, and specifically the high priest who like literally bore the name on his forehead. Okay, and that priestly context is going to be, part of, the part of the approach when it comes to this whole thing. Is there a connection to the Book of the Watchers? The key verse, though, is going to be verse 4. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Now, let's just back up a little bit and think about the 144,000 as they are cast in this passage. They're in the heavenly Zion, okay, God's throne room. This is a divine council scene, all right. verse 3, we have another reference to the throne and the cherubim. And, we go back, to Revelation 7 that follows on the heels of Revelation 4 and 5, pretty closely. And there hooks back into Revelation 4 and 5, the divine council scene. So we're in the heavenly Zion, God's throne room. We've got the cherubim here, the throne. It's the spiritual realm. Now, this is one reason why the 144,000 of chapter 7 are viewed as a different group. Okay, remember we talked about this in part 1. But why cannot John have have an earthly 144,000 who are then in the vision? Remember, this is a vision. Also before the throne of God. Perhaps this is some sort of commissioning scene. We talked about, is Revelation 7, or Revelation 4 and 5, I should say, is this a commissioning scene? Is it some other kind of way to look at this enthronement? Or, we went through all these different categories. And in the course of doing that, and then the course of the 144,000 in part 1, there was this division about whether Revelation 7 or Revelation 14 are two different groups. The majority of scholarship doesn't hold them as two different groups because this is a vision. There's no necessary reason why the 144,000, earthly can't also be present in heaven and so on and so forth, because this is a visionary context. We're at we've seen these guys before. Is this, some sort of flashback, to their commissioning? I mean, who knows? There's any number of ways to argue that they don't have to be distinguished. We're going to set that aside and focus on verses 4 and 5 here, because we've already sort of covered, this other topic. Verses 4 and 5 mark them as virgins, specifically male virgins who have, quote, not defiled themselves with women. And then thirdly, they're playing on their harps, they're singing a new song before the throne. So this is this heavenly scene. And then we've got this sort of weird, almost feels like a throwaway line. Like what is the fact that they haven't defiled themselves with women? What does that have to do with a divine council, a throne room scene, a heavenly, scene in the divine abode and worship? And, what does that have to do with anything? It just seems like it sticks out like a sore thumb. Now, again, that's one of the obvious questions. There are others that go along with this, because again, the passage starts out with this bearing the name concept, which again, a Jew would associate with Israelites bearing the name. And let's not forget, Israelites were supposed to be, quote unquote, a kingdom of priests. And we've got the high priest who literally bears the name on his forehead. So here's a question we could bring to it. Are the 144,000 here portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? Now, we've actually talked about this before in relationship to the elders and that whole discussion of Revelation 4 and 5. We talked a little bit about how certain sects of Judaism had this notion of that they were on earth the mirror image or the symbiotic, group that corresponded to the heavenly, the angelic priesthood. Okay, this is known from Qumran, the Shabbat Shirot, and so on and so forth. So this is a legitimate question. Are they portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? And again, one of the reasons you'd ask this question is the bearing the name concept, and also this, male virgin thing. Okay, so let's just proceed a little bit. We asked why this specific note, because Israelite priests could be married. I mean, there wasn't a rule against that. You go back in the Old Testament, you can see that very plainly. Now, last week we talked about how a few scholars, On and Balcom, suggested that the sexual abstinence here was part of a military motif. Practicing abstinence, sexual abstinence before going to war, and you'll find that in the Hebrew Bible. But if you think about that analogy, well, the warriors there, they weren't virgins. Okay, they might have abstained before going to battle, but they're not virgins. I mean, they're just not. Okay, so that doesn't seem to really work well. I mean, and, you could still argue a military context, at least, part of the context, on the basis of tribal arrangement, census, demonic opposition. I mean, you don't need this sexual abstinence motif to have the military flavoring of Revelation 7, the 144,000, be there. You have these other things that you can build the same argument out of. The abstinence idea is pretty weak, actually. And again, the virgin idea, specifically for some scholars, takes them in quite a different direction. Now, there are two scholarly studies on this passage that have argued that this description presents the 144,000 as priestly figures. Again, they're in the presence of God. They occupy sacred space. They're worshiping at the throne. They bear the name, okay? That they're priestly figures who are intended as an oppositional reverse analogy to the sexual defilement of God's other holy ones, who at one point occupied sacred space in heaven, but who did defile themselves by sexual engagement with women. And that would be the fallen sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4, or the Watchers, as they are known in Second Temple Jewish literature. Now, those two articles are D.C. Olson, and the title is Those Who Have Not Defiled Themselves with Women, subtitle, Revelation 14:4 and the Book of Enoch. That's from Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Volume 59, Number 3, 1997, pages 492 to 510. And then the second one is Terrell Manikam, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, and Jan A. Durand. The title here is The 144,000 Undefiled Levites. So it actually has it in the title, this priestly idea. The 144,000 undefiled Levites of Revelation 14:1-5, and the link to the defiled watchers of 1 Enoch 1-36. That's the title, long title. And the publication, the journal, is pretty obscure. In fact, this might be in my library of 7,000 or 8,000 journal articles that pertain to this sort of stuff. This might be the only article from this source. The Ecclesiasticos Pharos Journal, Volume 94, Number 1, 2012, pages 123 to 136. Now, I put both of these in the protected folder for anybody who's interested in them. In reversing Hermann, I really focus on Manikam and Durand's article. They reference Olson because Olson's was written, 1997. Theirs is 2012. So they interact with it. So I don't really bother in the book anyway, getting into the first one. But we're going to say a few things, here, draw a little bit more from from Olson, so that you get the flavor for what he's arguing. But I'm still going to use, Manikam and Durand to do that. Again, you can access both of these articles in the protected folder if you want to. So they take note, Manikam and Durand take note of Olson's work, obviously, as I just noted, and they write this. This is one point where they sort of summarize some things. Olson argues that the redeemed 144,000 virgins, Revelation 14:4a, stand in radical opposition to the defiled fallen angels mentioned in 1 Enoch 1-36, who were engaged in sexual practices with the daughters of men, Genesis 6:1-4. According to Olson, the 144,000 virgins of Revelation 14 are an anti-image to not only the followers of the beast mentioned in the preceding chapter and Revelation 14 again, 6-20, and of course we get the beast in Revelation 17 and 18, but also to the fallen angels of 1 Enoch 1-36. He also argues that by contrasting the redeemed with the watchers, John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of good angels, unquote. Again, that's very interesting, especially since we've already talked a little bit about angelic priesthood, both, in some earlier episodes. If you've read Unseen Realm, you should be familiar with this idea. We did an episode on Hebrews 12, the cloud of witnesses. I mean, we've been on this topic before, this notion of angelic priesthood or believers, joining the council and so on and so forth. So this is actually part of that mix. Olson, this is one of the angles that he pursues. Now, Manikam and Durand try to develop Olson's observation by more observations of the Watcher's tradition, and they expand the idea to argue that the 144,000 represent the entire people of God in the manner of the Old Testament idea of substitution. What they mean by that is that the whole firstborn thing, the Levites take the place of the firstborn offering of everything else. This is Numbers 3, 40, and 41. Okay, so that, God is owed the firstborn, and the tribe of Levi sort of has this function in the Old Testament. So he's drawing on that as well. And this is actually alluded to in Revelation 14. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. Okay, so this notion of substitution, a la, again, the firstborn, is actually mentioned in the passage. So Monacham and Duran are going to pursue that idea and a few other things from the Book of the Watchers to sort of build out Olson's argument. Now, for our purposes, really only the Watchers tradition is of interest, and we have to limit this somehow for this episode so we can get through Revelation 7. The other aspect, the firstborn, we're not going to do so much with that. But, I think this is a meaningful trajectory. I don't think his idea should be dismissed. I think this is, part of it. But in general, how do Monacham and Duran, with Olson, because they're on the same side too, how do they make these points? The idea that the 144,000 are a mere opposition to the fallen Watchers. So I'm going to just walk you through their arguments here. So what they do first is they go through some passages where Levites and angels do similar things, just general ministries. They look at different vocabulary for what angels do and then what Levites do and note, hey, the same Hebrew lemma is used here. Okay, that sort of thing. So they write this. The Levites were, to a certain degree, God's holy ministering servants on earth as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Let me just stop there. If you're already thinking of, again, this notion of how believers are going to be grafted into the council, and essentially replace what has been lost through rebellion in heaven. Again, this is all part of that matrix of ideas. So what they're suggesting here should be familiar to people in this audience who have, are familiar with the content of Unseen Realm and have been listening to the podcast for a while. So this is their beginning point, this simple observation. The Levites were to a certain degree God's holy ministering servants on earth as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Okay, this is also the concept of imaging. Why there's plurals in Genesis 1. Again, this is all Unseen Realm content, how the plurality language in that passage somehow links God with humans, with the heavenly host to whom God is speaking. And again, it's not the Trinity. I'm not going to rehearse all that material here, but it basically sets up this relationship between us. We are God's imagers here in this, in the earthly sphere He has created for human habitation. And they are God's imagers in the spiritual world. Again, simple idea, very straightforward. So they reference here Hebrews 1:14, Numbers 3:5-9, Numbers 8:11, Deuteronomy 18:5. Okay, they give a number of examples, but here's one. For example, both the angels and Levites were engaged in the worship of God. That's pretty easy, straightforward example. Hebrews 1:6, Revelation 4:5, Deuteronomy 18:5. Now, they move away from this pretty quickly. So as an editorial note here, just on my own, I actually think this part of their argument is weak and could be a lot stronger. And I think it needs to be because it's fairly central to where they're going to go. So I would suggest they need to strengthen this by working through the Second Temple material related to the idea of humans as the angelic priesthood. Again, Qumran is the example that the Qumran community clearly saw themselves this way. And in the absence of a literal temple, they mime temple service out there in the desert. They're effectively casting themselves as the quote-unquote real Levites. Okay, we're the real priests here that kept heaven and earth in sync. Again, all you got to do is read anything on Qumran calendar, the whole disagreement, over that issue, why they separate from the Jerusalem priesthood. I mean, there's a lot more they could do with this, but they don't. So it's kind of disappointing, but it's still a legitimate point. If you want a quick article on that, again, I've referenced this before in earlier episodes, Devorah Demont, Men as Angels, the Self-Image of the Qumran Community. And that's from the book Religion and Politics in the Ancient Near East, Studies in Jewish History and Culture. It's a 1996 book. So she has a chapter in that. It's quite good. Secondly, here's the second trajectory they follow. So the first thing they say is, hey, there's this service relationship. Second, the Watchers forsook their heavenly standing by defiling themselves with earthly women. In other words, they transgressed both the boundary between them and humanity, and in so doing, they despised the identity given to them by God. They thus no longer represent the holy ones of heaven. The opposite of this, in this argument, is the virginity. They have, quote unquote, not defiled themselves with women, unquote. The opposite of this is the virginity of the 144,000 and their election to represent believers, or if one prefers, Jewish believers. That goes back to part one, that whole argument. Number 3, the Levitical instructions about who priests should marry, that's Leviticus 21, contains language similar to that of Revelation 14 in regard to the 144,000. So yes, priests could marry. They're not, virgins, but nevertheless, we get instructions about who priests should marry and who they shouldn't. This is Leviticus 21, 14, and 15. A widow or a divorced woman or a woman who has been defiled or a prostitute, these he, the priest, shall not marry. But he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people, that he may not profane his offspring among his people. Okay, that's one of the Levitical rules, for who priests should marry. So they're correct here. There's some of this language is picked up on, or at least there's an echo here in Revelation 14. Now, this description, again, this not defile themselves among women or with women. This description, it is argued by Monicam and Durand and Olson, is how first Enoch views what the Watchers did. And here's what they think is a direct connection. So I'm going to read 1 Enoch 15, 1 through 9. So this is how the writer of 1 Enoch views what the Watchers did. And you're going to see that there are thematically, and in terms of, if we compared the lemmas here with LXX of, Leviticus and Revelation, you're going to get some hits. You're going to get some matches here. But just conceptually, here's how the writer of 1 Enoch viewed the offense. 1 Enoch 15, verse 1. And he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach hither and hear my voice. And go, say to the watchers of heaven, who have sent thee to intercede for them. Remember, the watchers try to get Enoch to be a negotiator with God. Okay, let us get out of the chains and the abyss and all that stuff, okay? So go, say to the watchers of heaven who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons. And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh. And as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also do who die and perish. In other words, you're behaving like mortals. Verse 5, Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on the earth. There's God says, this is why I let humans do this, because they need to perpetuate the species, all right? Verse 6, But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world, and therefore I have not appointed wives for you, for as the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits of flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they were born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. That's the end of the passage. It's very clear, origin of evil spirits, demons from this event. This is one of the more explicit passages. So consequently, the argument is, when you hit Revelation 14:4, and you read, It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins, that language is meant to be a mirror opposite of what the Watchers did. So the 144,000 are the other side of the Watchers' coin. Fourth trajectory that is used here. Since the 144,000 are seen in Revelation 14 in the heavenly temple, and they are opposite the Watchers in terms of purity and faithfulness, they also symbolically replace the Watchers. Hence, Monicam and Durand's summary of Olson, quote, John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of the good angels, unquote. This, of course, also dovetails with the broader idea that believers replace the fallen council members, which is, that's wider than Genesis 6, but obviously this would play a big part of that. Now, as I noted in Reversing Hermon, that book, quote, the theological point is that the 144,000 holy ones who fight the beast, the Antichrist, are counterparts to the holy ones who rebelled and defiled themselves with women. John telegraphs that these holy ones will help their earthly compatriots defeat the beast and rectify the impurity brought to earth by the Watchers. again, I think there is something to this approach, but I'd like to see more thorough research done in defense of it. In other words, I like the content of Olson and Monicam and Duran's articles, but there are parts of the argument that need development, and I think could get further development. So this is sort of a dissertation topic, really. I'd like to see more thorough research into Revelation 7 and 14 with the Septuagint vocabulary, for instance, about the priests, aligning that plus or minus, with the Greek Enoch vocabulary. And then I'd like to see a thorough investigation of angelic priesthood texts. There are just things that they could do, I think, to make to add support, to bolster this argument, this trajectory. But right now, where I sit, looking at the work that exists on this point, I think there's something to it. I do think there's something to it. It let's put it this way: this has pretty good explanatory power. It's better than, this is like warriors in Israel who didn't have sex before going out to battle. That's actually quite weak. This is better. Doesn't mean it's the right, answer. So it's just better. It has more explanatory power, and I'd like to just see more done with it. Let's go on to number 2, Antichrist and Dan. And again, this is quite debatable. In Reversing Hermon, I'm just going to read you some parts of Reversing Hermon so we get into the subject. I take a sort of a less positive view of this in that book. And again, I have to be cagey here because I'm actually going to use this idea in its association with some other things in the third novel. But anyway, from Reversing Hermon, I wrote this. Dan had a checkered history. The tribe forsook its allotted inheritance in the south of Canaan and migrated north, appropriating the priest of Micah the Levite, who kept household gods and an idol in his house. That's Joshua 19:40-48 and Judges 18. The Danites eventually conquered the city of Laish and renamed it Dan, Judges 18:27 and 29, and this city became a cult center to Baal in later Israelite history. Earlier in Israel's history, instead of receiving a blessing from the dying Jacob like his brothers, the patriarch pronounced instead, quote, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards, unquote. Thanks for the blessing, Dad. That's not really a blessing. It's Genesis 49:17. To continue with what I wrote, Deuteronomy 33:22 contains the cryptic note that, quote, Dan is a lion's cub that leaps from Bashan, unquote. And there's Bashan again, the creepy place. Now, these failures and passages associate Dan with rebellion against God, the region of Bashan, whose name in Canaanite would have been Bathan, serpent, and Baal worship at a location at the foot of Mount Hermon. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, all right? Back to what I wrote here. It is no wonder that some early church writers believed that the reason Dan was omitted from Revelation 7 was because the Antichrist, in other words, the enemy of the 144,000, would come from the tribe of Dan. That's a belief you'll find in early church writings. And then I quote C.E. Hill, who has a journal article that's a study of this idea, this tradition. He writes this, our first explicit mention of a Jewish Antichrist comes in the writings of Irenaeus, where it occurs already in tandem with the opinion that he will also spring from the tribe of Dan. This is his Against Heresies 5.30.2. Somewhat surprisingly, Irenaeus brings forth but 2 scriptural passages in support of Antichrist's Danite origin. The first is Jeremiah 8:16 in the Septuagint, which in English translation is, we shall hear the voice of his swift horses from Dan. The whole earth shall be moved by the voice of the neighing of his galloping horses. He shall also come and devour the earth, and the fullness thereof, the city also, and they that dwell therein, unquote. Continuing with Hill, he, Irenaeus, finds further support for this in the omission of Dan from the list of the 12 tribes of the sealed in Revelation 7:5-7. Little ellipsis here. Antichrist from the tribe of Dan makes his first known appearance in Irenaeus, but it is in Hippolytus that he finds his most scrupulous and eloquent biographer. Hippolytus's copious description proceeds on the principle that, quote, the deceiver seeks to liken himself in all things to the Son of God, unquote. As Jesus was the lion from the tribe of Judah, referring to Jacob's blessing on Judah in Genesis 49:17, Antichrist will be the lion from the tribe of Dan, referring to Moses' blessing, or his words at least, on the tribe of Dan in Deuteronomy 33:22. So that's the end of the hill quotation. Now, the difficulty with these ideas is that the Antichrist figure elsewhere, okay, is pretty clearly Gentile. Isn't that interesting? And here, again, I have to be a little cagey. All I'm going to say, in reversing Hermann, I brought up this point. So look, the Antichrist elsewhere is a Gentile. And of course, evangelicals assume that Antichrist means some sort of fake counterfeit Jesus, and so they opt for a Jew. But the Antichrist idea of the New Testament generates from, again, two Old Testament sources or ideas. The first is the Messiah must surely have a final day of the Lord enemy. In other words, that's not a counterfeit Messiah, but an enemy, an oppositional figure. Okay, like a supernaturally empowered warrior or a divine warrior that aligns himself against the divine warrior that is the Messiah. And therefore, it would make sense for a Gentile to be opposed to a Jewish Messiah. So that's one trajectory in the Old Testament. The second is that Daniel 9 and 11 get repurposed in the New Testament. If Daniel is accurate in historical terms in these chapters, the eschatological enemy of the people of God in that material was Antiochus IV, who was a Gentile. Okay, so this is what casts the Antichrist firmly in New Testament scholarship as a Gentile. Now let's go back here. You know, we've got all that. And again, we sort of operate with this assumption. Again, the difficulty of these ideas, the Antichrist figures elsewhere is pretty clearly a Gentile. Okay, here's the question. And I'm not going to get into it here because this would be a whole episode, maybe 2 episodes. And again, it's a trajectory for my 3rd novel. What if Dan was not an Israelite tribe? That would make Dan Gentile, wouldn't it? There's a historical problem with Dan and the Danite migration in Joshua and the book of Judges. And it goes like this. Again, this is very short form. And there are ways that you could acknowledge what I'm going to say here and still have Dan be an Israelite tribe who it would be and not be. In other words, there's one of the explanations for what I'm going to share with you here is that the original Jewish tribe of Dan in the south was either conquered or willingly assimilated. People known as the Denyen or the Danunai or the Dan. There's like 3 or 4 different spellings of this here. So the Denyen, the Danu Naoi, the Danu, okay, Danunen. I mean, again, there's a bunch of different spellings. It's a Sea People tribe. It's a Gentile tribe from specifically the Aegean and even more specifically Mycenae. Now, if you've read my 2nd novel, Mycenae should just make, the hair on the back of your neck stand up, okay? So there's this whole issue of, Dan. Why is Dan referenced later in the prophets? Dan, why did he stay in the ships, at a certain, battle? Why didn't he fight against, certain peoples in the promised land that were also sea peoples? Well, maybe it's because Dan was essentially a sea people tribe, or maybe it's because Dan was a seafaring tribe because that's what the sea people, you see all these things. This is again, one of these little subset issues in Old Testament scholarship. It doesn't mean that there weren't 12 original tribes, including an original Jewish Dan tribe. But what it does mean is that Dan has problems, okay? Dan could very well be conceived of as a group of sea peoples, predominantly, that usurp this tribe's position, migrate north, and do Gentile stuff, and basically become a problem, historically, theologically, religiously. And if that's the case, a Jew wouldn't have sort of been startled if you would have suggested that the Antichrist might come from Dan, and it works with Gentile typologies. That's a possibility. That's all I'm going to say here. Okay. So the Danite problem, the Danite migration problem, is an issue that might contribute to a Dan Antichrist typology. Now, I don't discuss this in Reversing Hermann. Again, that would have been like adding 100 pages to the book, and I couldn't do that at that point. But you're going to see this again, okay? Again, if you read my fiction, that's where I get to play with it a little bit. But I'm telling you here because we should not dismiss the Danite Antichrist thing, and let's just say it more broadly, the great eschatological enemy thing, okay? The opponent of the eschatological Messiah and his people being a Gentile, Dan might be part of that picture. It might be part of that typology. We should not exclude that or dismiss it if we're committed to this great eschatological enemy being a Gentile. I think that's fairly obvious, okay, that he's not a Jew, but that doesn't exclude the Dan thing. Okay, enough said there. So, it's difficult to really say too much more about that, but that is the Dan Antichrist trajectory. And one of the prongs of it, one of the things that propels it, is probably a better way to say it, is the omission of Dan in, the 144,000 list. Now, you might recall from the first episode, part 1 here, that's not the only omission. Who else is omitted? Okay, usually, think of the 12, the original 12. Okay, Dan included, and Joseph. Okay, those are the 12 sons of Israel. Usually, when Joseph is not included, in the tribal, lists, what do you get? We get his 2 boys, his 2 sons, half tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, guess which other other than Joseph, he doesn't show up in a lot of tribal lists anyway. But his usual stand-ins, Ephraim and Manasseh, also do, there's an issue there. Guess which one of those is not in Revelation 7's list? Ephraim. Okay, why would that be significant? Well, because Ephraim was the capital of the apostate northern kingdom. Okay, and Ephraim, in Ephraim's territory, the whole of it, Bashan is included in Dan to Beersheba. Dan is in the north, okay? So Ephraim's not there either. So again, this is one of those things where there could be something to this, and we shouldn't dismiss it because of the Gentile part of the typology. So to me, it really hinges on whether there's a Danite problem and how the Danite problem worked, which is probably an unanswerable question. What exactly happened here? But if something happened to make the other tribes suspicious of Dan, and that something at least included something of a Gentile composition in their people, okay, in the tribe, the tribe gets polluted. We'll just say it, with Gentiles. Okay, there's this. If that's the case, then that's on the table. It's on the table, when it comes to this other material. So let's move on. Again, there's a lot you can run around and do research on the Danite problem. Like I said, it's complicated, lots of facets to it, a number of different ways to address it. But that's a subject for 1 or 2 other episodes, and I don't know that we'll ever do that. But again, you will see it in the novel, number 3. Third, let's just move on and mop up the chapter here. Revelation 7, 13, and 14. There's one other thing I want to get into here, and that is the phrase Great Tribulation. Okay, so let's go to Revelation 7, 13. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come?" And I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." Okay, that's Revelation 7, 13, and 14. Now, I want to just say a few things about this phrase, because as soon as you say great tribulation, that phrase is going to be interpreted. It's going to be parsed in certain ways by certain end times systems. Okay. We've already talked about the Old Testament. We already talked, I should say, about the Old Testament context for the white robe imagery. Again, that in the verses I just read. We're not going to go back and rehearse all that, but I want to focus on this phrase. That's all we're going to do the rest of the episode. It does have an Old Testament context, and it's not what many in the audience might presume. The usual idea is Great Tribulation equals the 70th week of Daniel. But the concept of a 7-year tribulation never appears in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. Okay, when you get the 70th week talk. The closest you come is Daniel 9, 25 in that mix. Let me just read this to you. Daniel 9, 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. So the troubled time is again a possible reference vocabulary associated with a tribulation period. But if you'll notice, this stuff happens. It'll be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. This stuff would happen somewhere during the first 69 weeks. It's not the 70th week. Okay, the anointed one rises, and you have this building going on in a troubled time, and then it's only later that the anointed one gets cut off, and so on and so forth. So it's not a match. A lot of people think it is, but it's not if you actually look closely at what it's saying. So that's one problem. The other problem is the vocabulary for tribulation never occurs with the terminology for week or 7 in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. So the assumption that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel or the last 7 of Daniel, there's actually no textual support for that. Now that doesn't mean it can't be. It means there's no textual support for it. There is, though, a better Old Testament context for the quote-unquote Great Tribulation language, and that is Daniel 12:1. I'm going to read Revelation 7:13 and 14 again, just so that you have that ringing in your head. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these, clothed in white robes, and where have they come?" I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the Great Tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." So let's take a look at the elements. Okay, we have Revelation 17, 13, 14. We just read that. It references a great tribulation. You're also going to get this language in the New Testament in Matthew 24, 21. Let me just read that for you. We might as well read that. Again, this is an eschatological passage, part of the Olivet Discourse here. Pray that your fight, this is verse 20, pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then, verse 21, there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So like this is the ultimate, tribulation, okay? So you have this language in Revelation 7, 13, and 14, Matthew 24, 21. You have believers and martyrs on behalf of the Lamb who have gone through the Great Tribulation. That's Revelation 7. Okay, these are the ones who are coming out of the Great Tribulation. They've gone through the Great Tribulation. They're glorified because they have white robes. Their faith in the Lamb has saved them despite the Great Tribulation. Now, if the tribulation is at a close in Revelation 7, and basically all eschatological views are going to say that, then we're at the final day of the Lord judgment, which includes the great white throne, the book of life, and all that sort of stuff, because we got this glorification element and so on and so forth. Now, the context, Old Testament context. Here's Daniel 12:1. Just listen to Daniel 12:1 in light of Revelation 7, 13, and 14, and then Matthew 24:21. Here's Daniel 12:1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Okay, again, look at the elements and their overlap with Revelation 7, 13, and 14, and Matthew 24, 21. You have an end of days tribulation. There's no number assigned to it. Doesn't say it's 7 years, doesn't say it's anything. It's tribulation. And it's great because of the wording. Quote, this tribulation is such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. And because of that wording, scholars will link Daniel 12:1 to another Old Testament passage, Jeremiah 30, verse 7. And I'll read that. Alas, that day is so great, there is none like it. It is a time of distress for Jacob, i.e. Israel. Yet he shall be saved out of it. Now, this is the passage where you get the phrase time of Jacob's trouble, which, again, certain end-time systems will marry to the 7-year Great Tribulation and consider that the 70th week of Daniel. Again, there's certainly a connection there, but there's no number in any of these passages, and there's no association with the weeks of Daniel. Again, that's a problem for specific systems, all right? But you have an end of days tribulation, And it's great, again, because that's the way it's worded. There's like this, never have seen anything like this. It never will be again. Second element, the righteous are delivered, the people of God, whose names are found written in the book. Okay, I think this is obviously the book of life. On here, to loop him in, he writes, part of a series of events associated with the arrival of the eschaton in early Judaism and early Christianity is in view here. I mean, this language in Revelation 7, 13, and 14 gets picked up in Second Temple Jewish literature. Okay, I say picked up because scholars think its source is Daniel 12 and Jeremiah 30 and so on and so forth. For instance, you got Testament of Moses 8:1, Jubilees 23, 11 through 21, 4th Ezra 13, 16, and 19, the second apocalypse of Baruch 27, 1 through 15. There are other, again, Jewish texts in the Second Temple period that pick up on these passages and talk about them in kind of the same ways that you're also going to see in Revelation 7, 13, and 14. So even ancient people associated this language from Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37, with the apocalypse. And of course, Revelation is an apocalypse and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of agreement here in terms of the ancient literature. Where there's disagreement is how modern end times systems, what they do with this and sort of information that gets added along the way. Now, On also writes this: since the Danielic phrase "time of distress," okay, this time of trouble, was interpreted as the time of the battle against the Kittim, that means Westerners, in 1 QM, that's the War Scroll, 1, 11, and 12, and chapter 15, verse 1. Since that's true, Bauckham suggests that the phrase, quote, "those who emerge from the Great Tribulation," here in Revelation 7, 13, and 14, means, quote, "those who emerge victorious from the eschatological war," okay, unquote. On continues and says, it appears that while the Great Tribulation belonged to a discrete series of events in Jewish eschatological expectation, early Christians regarded their frequent experience of persecution and opposition as part of this eschatological period of tribulation presaging the end. And preterists like that because that's essentially the preterist argument, at least in terms of the flavor of it. Now, Beale, and who's not a preterist, but Beale is going to express these ideas this way. He says, Daniel 12:1 is acknowledged as the likely origin for the idea of the Great Tribulation. Quote, "There will be a time of tribulation, such tribulation as has not come about from when a nation was on earth until that time." That Daniel is in mind is also apparent from the fact that the phrase Great Tribulation occurs in the New Testament outside Revelation only in Matthew 24:21, where it is part of a fuller and more explicit reference to Daniel 12:1. He references Mark 13:19. He also references the War Scroll, so on and so forth, for these ideas. These are prophecies that God will protect the Israelite saints as they pass through the imminent, unprecedented time of distress prophesied in Daniel 12:1, after which they will be rewarded with eternal blessing. In Daniel's tribulation, the eschatological opponent persecutes the saints because of their covenant loyalty to God. That's Daniel 11:30 through 39. Verse 44, and also Daniel 12:10. Some will apostatize and persecute those remaining loyal, especially attempting to cause them to forsake their loyalty. Therefore, the tribulation consists of pressures to compromise the faith, these pressures coming both from within the church community through seductive teaching and from without through overt oppression. Sometimes the persecution is economically oriented. So you have thlipsis, the word tribulation in Revelation 2:9, to afflict. You get the same thing in Leviticus 26:26 in the Septuagint, where it refers to a famine of bread and distributing loaves by weight, which stands partly behind, in Beale's mind, Revelation 6:5 through 6. At other times, the tribulation is heightened to include imprisonment and even death, Revelation 2:10, thlipsis, tribulation. Whatever its nature, tribulation always comes because of believers' faithful witness to Jesus. The greatness of the tribulation, therefore, and again in Beale's thinking, is the intensity of the seduction and the intensity of the oppression through which believers pass. Now, another item here. If Revelation 3:10 is an allusion to Daniel 12:1, let's read Revelation 3:10. We'll go back there. We've hit this before. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth. So if that's an allusion to Daniel 12:1, which would then be connected to Revelation 7, 13, and 14, then one could argue, now catch this, one could argue that the Great Tribulation is yet another already but not yet element in biblical thought. Because Revelation 3 is addressed to the churches that are already boots on the ground. Okay, if Revelation 3:10 refers to Daniel 12:1, the writer sees this happening already, but then you're going to get these later passages where it's not yet. It's still something prospective. So the tribulation itself, this great end times tribulation, whatever it is, again, that people assume is the 70th week of Daniel, even though there's no textual support for that. Whatever that is, could be an already but not yet thing in the mind of the writer of Revelation. And that's actually Beale's position. Here's what he writes, just before we wrap up here. Indeed, the author of 1 Maccabees 9:27 understood that the great tribulation of Daniel 12:1 had already begun in the 2nd century BC, as a result of the chaos produced by Judas's death at the hands of Israel's enemy. This is Judas Maccabee. He writes, this is the writer of Maccabees 9:20, 1 Maccabees 9:27. So there was a great tribulation, thlipsis megale, in Israel, the like of which had not occurred since the time that a prophet was not seen among them, unquote. Midrash of Psalm 119:31 applies Daniel 12:10 tribulation prophecy to the afflictions of Israel throughout history. Okay, so, on and on and on. He lists a few other examples here, and he writes, we have seen that the hour of testing in Revelation 3:10 also alludes to Daniel 12:1 and Daniel 12:10, so he thinks they are connected, and that it appears to include the entire time before Jesus' ministry and the parousia, again, the second coming. If so, the present analysis of the tribulation in Revelation 7:14 is supported further, though others also see a parallel between 3:10 and 7:14, but see both as alluding to something in the future, a final trial at the very end of history. So what Beale is arguing is that could be already, but not yet. And again, that's where he lands, because Maccabees picks up the language and some other sources already. Again, the people of God are under oppression all the way a couple centuries BC, all the way through the 1st century when John is writing the book of Revelation. It's already, but it's not yet. It's already happening. Believers are under oppression, but not yet. At the end, the ultimate consummation of this persecution, this tribulation, has yet to come. So at the very least, let's just wrap up this way. At the very least, here's what can be said about the great tribulation of Revelation 7, 13, and 14 in biblical thought. Number one, it's certainly connected to Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37. I don't think there's any way to deny that. Number two, it's therefore linked to Matthew 24:21. Number three, it is a time that precedes the final judgment and return of Jesus. Remember the white robes, okay, the book of life. So it's a time that precedes that, and it involves persecution of believers. That's number four. That's about what you can say about the Great Tribulation for sure. Notice there's no reference to weeks. There's no time. There's no number of years. All of that kind of stuff is supplied or kept from being part of the equation by whatever your end time system happens to be. So we shouldn't be making assumptions that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel. Hey, maybe that's the way it'll turn out. Who knows? Okay. But there isn't a verse to hang that on, is the point. Rather, it might be this already but not yet thing, again, which wouldn't necessarily exclude the former. But again, it'd be sure nice to have a verse for that numerical equation, but we don't have it. So again, ultimately, this is what you're left with. This is why we have different end time systems. This is why if you love one and you need this element in it for it to work, you're going to cheat. You're just going to say it and that works. And now we move on to the next point. If you don't like, that eschatological system, you're going to say there's not even room for discussing this. Forget it. Blah 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 blah. You're going to dismiss it from the realm of possibility just out of the gate. It's a non-discussion item. And so there you go. This is how systems work. Both sides are going to do this at different points to make their system beautiful, and they're all beautiful, except where they're not. Okay, they're all beautiful until something messes with them, which is why in this series we're not propping up an end times system. Okay, I just want you to be thinking about Old Testament antecedents to these ideas, to the content here of Revelation 7 here in part 2. So Again, possible connection, again, to Genesis 6, i.e. the Book of the Watchers stuff, the way that's worded, the way that was taken in Second Temple Judaism, the way that was understood. And you've got the Danite problem, the great eschatological enemy. Does he have a relationship to Dan? Okay, that's again, there's data there for that, but again, we don't necessarily know for sure. And then third, the Great Tribulation. All these things have Old Testament precedent antecedents, and that's what we're trying to do in this series of the podcast. Just introduce you to these things so that you can think about them when you're studying, in this case, the Book of Revelation.
Mike, we want hardcore answers here. We want to know the facts. We want to know exactly which one
you want.
Don't.
You want hardcore speculation.
Yeah, we want to pinpoint it down to one. Well, give us a bunch of them. We want the right.
That's what the
one.
Novel's for. Hardcore speculation.
That was my next thing. You mentioned that. So what's up with that? Can we expect that sometime soon?
Well, soon is a relative term, Trey.
2021.
It'd be nice to hand this off to my little circle of draft readers, who help me with the first two, by the end of the year. That would be wonderful. So I don't know if anyone defines soon as early next year or not. I think that's probably the best timetable I can give you. But anyway,
okay,
that's where we're
definitely 2022 is what you're saying.
Oh, I would think so. Absolutely.
Okay, so you're guaranteed right now. You're willing to go on the record that 2022 is guaranteed.
I'm going to go out on that limb. Yes, sometime in 2020, December 31st, January.
Breaking news! You heard it here first.
2022,
guaranteed. All right, in time for Christmas, 2022. There you go. All right. Well, that's good stuff. Mike, I also wanted to mention to people out there that we are going to do a Q&A of Revelation. So start gathering your questions. If you have some, you can go ahead and send those to me at treystrickland@gmail.com. In the subject, if you would, just please put Revelation Q&A or something so I can keep those together. But, or if you want to wait
no questions about Dan.
To the
no
end.
questions about Dan, and no questions about ducks either. Okay.
Hey, why not? You're gonna have to give us an update on the War of the Ducks.
That's right. Our apocalyptic war against these two ducks. So.
Exactly. All right, that's it, Mike. And with that, I think next week we're going to be doing a Q&A. So we'll be looking forward to Q&A next week. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.